Thank you for joining us for this Licensed Officials webinar, which is part of Motorsport UK's Learning and Development Week, a week in which we're going to aim to provide you, as officials, a chance to further develop your knowledge and your skills, and to engage with us as the governing body on some key topics. My name is James Betchley, and I am the Motorsport UK Officials Pathway Manager. And joining me on hosting duties on this quite snowy morning is Sue Sanders, the Director of Learning and Development. Good morning, Sue.
Classic error. Maybe that's hopefully the only time I shall do it today. Morning, James. Morning, everyone. Lovely to be here, safely behind double glazing, outside of the snow or inside and away from the snow. First of all, a real big welcome to everybody, and thank you for your Sunday mornings here joining us. Can't imagine that in 2019, when it was the last officials webinar, we would have imagined that we would hold this one in this way. I mean, we had no concept of such a thing. Anyway, technology has been an amazing help to us during these times, and hopefully you will take a lot away from this webinar, giving you a good sense of confidence about where we are, where we're going and what we're doing. And we've worked very hard to try and get the content and the format in a good way. James will explain a little bit more about how to interact with us, but we will be keeping our eyes on the Q&A box, and our fingers will be flying to try and answer any of your questions on the way through. We've got some fabulous panelists, and a great thank you to them too for being here. I'll return you back to James, who will take us through the housekeeping arrangements.
Thanks, Sue. Yes, as Sue says, they're very different times. We're very glad to be behind some double glazing this morning. If any of you were with us in East Midlands at Donington a few years back, you'd remembered that we had similar conditions then. And I think if we'd have had this Zoom facility in those days, we probably would have used it to good use then as well. Now, this is the part, as we say, this is a different environment. This is the part where normally I'd be telling you where the nearest fire escapes are and also where the nearest toilet facilities are. But hopefully I don't have to do that, being that you are in your own homes. But there are some other housekeeping items I do just need to bring to your attention. First of all, this webinar is being recorded. Reason being that we want to share a copy of the recording with you after the session, and also to your colleagues that haven't been able to be here this morning with us. You are all muted and restricted from actually speaking. So what we'd like you to do is that if you've got a query during the session this morning, please do pop it in the Q&A box. You'll find that if you're on a computer, if you move your mouse around, you'll find that on the toolbar at the bottom of the screen. If you're on a smartphone or a tablet, simply touch on the screen and that toolbar should appear. Another thing that we're going to do, as the Q&A function, as I say, is actually monitored by the panelists, as Sue just touched upon. We'll try and answer as many of your questions as possible during the session, but another thing we're going to do is we're going to have a Q&A session at the end of the webinar, so you might want to hold onto your question until then to see if it's answered during the presentation this morning. So before we get started then, we'd like to ask you a quick question. I'm going to press a button here and we're going to launch a quick poll for you, and what we'd like you to do, when you see the options appear on your screen, we'd like you to select all of the answers that apply to you. The question is that, which of the following officials licenses do you hold? If you can select all that apply and then submit your answers, and we'll see who we've got in the room with us this morning. Maybe we'll see which type of official is the early riser, and then this afternoon we'll see who likes to join the afternoon sessions instead. Give you a couple more seconds there for the votes to come in. Brilliant, thank you very much. And I'll end it there and share the results with you. And you can see that the clerks of the course have got it again for the third time running. We've got the majority of the people in the room, clerks of the course, closely followed by scrutineers and then Motorsport UK stewards. And it's great to see the other officials represented here as well, from rescue, recovery, timekeeping, and some trainees in the room as well. So it's fantastic to have you with us this morning. So who else do we have with us this morning? Well, from Motorsport UK, we're very pleased to have Hugh Chambers, our Chief Executive, John Ryan, the Director of Sporting, Safety and Technical, Sue Sanders, the Director of Learning and Development, Cheryl Lynch, the Race, Speed and Kart Executive, Dan Carter, the Safety Executive, myself there, the Officials Pathway Manager, and also Joe Hickerton, the Technical Manager. I'm also very grateful to the people on the screen there now for their input into this webinar this morning. In fact, all of the sessions this weekend, their assistance in putting together the content, and also some of them are actually on our panel today as well. So welcome to them, and thank you again for your help and assistance. We couldn't have done it without you. So what are we actually going to be looking at in this morning's session then? So after this welcome, I'll pass over to Hugh Chambers, who will do a short introduction before taking us through some of the latest news out of Motorsport UK. Following that, we'll be handing over to John Ryan, who will lead us in looking at probably the biggest thing that's happened to most of us in the past 10 to 12 months, that word COVID-19. We're going to have a look at how the pandemic has affected motorsport, both in the past, currently, and what our future considerations may be. We will have a comfort break about halfway through this morning's session, so we can grab a cup of tea or coffee, and then we will move on into an incident reporting session where Dan Carter, our safety executive, will talk us through some of the processes needed to get that information to us and the importance of doing so. Following that, as I say, we will close out this afternoon with a Q&A session. We've got some questions that have been submitted in advance, and we'll also try and answer any questions that are still in the Q&A box as well. So without further ado, I will pass you over to Hugh Chambers. I hope you have an enjoyable morning and you find it informative and interesting. And I'll pass over to Hugh. Hugh.
Thank you, James, and a very good morning to everybody around the country. As the other panelists have said, I think we're all very grateful not to be traveling today, and certainly challenging conditions out there for many of us. I just also want to thank everybody for spending their time over this weekend and over the next week in attending the training sessions. A great deal of work goes into these sessions. It's all compressed into sort of 2.5, 3 hours, but there's many weeks of work that sit behind this. And I can assure you that everybody on the team at Motorsport UK is passionate and dedicated towards finding solutions which are going to make sure that we get back to competition as soon as we possibly can. And returning to competition was what we sought to do last year as well. And I'd very much like to thank everybody on the call this morning for everything that you did last year in enabling the sport to continue for so much of the year. July the 4th, we resumed activities. We had another lockdown in November, but the majority of the summer season for most of the disciplines was able to take place. Of course, rallying was the worst hit and the slowest to return for the reasons that we know. But nonetheless, some activities did take place. And of course, the lockdown now has coincided with, for the majority of our disciplines, the slowdown or even the closed season in our activities. So in that regard, we're somewhat fortunate compared to some other sports. It also allows us to pause for breath and to reflect on our learnings from last year and to plan for the year ahead. So it could be an awful lot worse. I think what is on everybody's mind is, when will competition start again? And of course, none of us know. I think it would be fair to say that even the scientific advisors to the government and the government themselves can't be sure at the moment when the lockdown will be lifted. In sessions yesterday, I think there was a general sentiment that it would be very helpful to know when Motorsport UK will lift the suspension of permits and that we'll be able to resume activities. I don't think we can do that as of now. It is going to be a little while before the government gives us guidance on when they see things beginning to unlock. But I think our estimates at the moment are that it's unlikely to be before the end of March, beginning of April, that anything in the country, let alone motorsport, really does start to see the sort of freedoms that we enjoyed last summer. So I think we're in this for the long haul. However, I think it is potentially rather different than it was last year. And the difference, of course, is vaccines and the treatments that are available now for the disease, and the comprehension that the scientists and the medical community have for everything that's required to beat the pandemic. And in that regard, there is a very real probability that once we get through this spring, we can see a long-term return to a somewhat normal activity. I think we'd all agree that it's unlikely to return to completely as it was before the pandemic anytime soon. But I am hopeful and confident that we can return with motorsport in a broadly uninterrupted way once things start to unlock in the summer. And the reason that we've been able to resume activities successfully last year is because of the ingenuity, the innovation, the passion and the dedication of all of our officials, our volunteers, our marshals, the scrutineers, timekeepers, all of the people involved in putting on a motorsport event have shown incredible dedication and passion to make this happen. And I really want to thank everybody for doing that. It's not been easy. I think my colleagues at Motorsport UK have provided the guidelines and continually updated the protocols around it. But at the end of the day, it's all of you on the ground, in the field, that actually have to execute them. And we're deeply grateful for that. Thank you so much. So moving forwards, last year clearly was interrupted. And it wasn't just interrupted in terms of competition, it was also in terms of our journey as Motorsport UK. Many of you will have heard or read mine and David Richards' comments about our belief that we need to ensure the long-term sustainability of motorsport in this country. And to do that, we've got to have a strategy of growth. It's not enough just to manage a gradual decline or see our sport slowly get eroded by all of the forces that are working against it. We've got to be out there and energetic and bringing new people into the sport, and indeed reinvent what the sport actually is, both in terms of its physical presentation, the type of machinery, but also the formats of the sport. And I'll talk a little bit more about that in a moment. But this mission statement, you'll have seen it before. We first published it in 2018. And I think it's very clear that we have an overarching ambition to continue to make it safe, fair and fun, recognize the need that the society is moving on and changing. We've got to be progressive, we've got to be innovative, and then make sure we have a sustainable future for our sport. So there are 4 pillars, you can just go to the next slide, which really drive our strategic imperatives and the plans that we have, all focused around people and member focus, the promotion of the sport, sport development and innovation, and finally governance and regulations, which is really the bedrock, if you like, the foundations of any governing body. Just quickly go through each of those. People and member focus, and this is something I really want to emphasize, that not only is it Motorsport UK as in the governing body, but I think it's everybody in the community has a requirement, a need to think of our competitors, think of our spectators, think of everybody in the community as our customers. These are people who pay for the sport out of their own pocket. They've got a choice to do lots of other things with their money, and we need to make sure that they have an enjoyable time. We need to make sure that everything is run in a strictly correct and proper manner, and that it is safe, but also that it's enjoyable, that it's fun. And it starts at the centre. As I say, I think that the team at Motorsport UK have done a terrific job. The feedback we get from our community in terms of customer service, I think is improving all the time. And we're dedicated and absolutely focused on making sure that we improve that every step of the way. The next slide, please. Promotion of the sport. I just said, you know, we have got some existential threats facing the sport. The way in which the automobile is now positioned within society, it's less and less something that people see as just a fun thing that they can go out on a Sunday afternoon with. It's a utilitarian tool that people use to get from A to B. With the advent of automated driving and artificial intelligence, the driving experience is, for many people, becoming more and more remote. We need to make sure we promote the excitement and the enjoyment and the freedom of motorsport. And it's not really relevant what the propulsion form is, whether electric vehicles or internal combustion engines. It's all about the ability to control a machine and to get fun out of the thrill of that competition, either against yourself or against other people. And we need to promote that, not just to our own communities. We don't need to just continually talk to ourselves. We need to get out there and speak to new audiences and invite new people into the sport. And thirdly, next slide, thank you, sport development. In order to do that, we've got to keep pace with the way that society is moving. And you've probably heard the expression, you know, people are perhaps a little bit wealthier, so they're maybe a little bit richer, but they are also time poor. And that sort of time poor notion means that people don't necessarily want to give up their whole weekend for their hobbies. Maybe they've got pressure from their family and their home life. We've got to look at product innovation, ways in which people can dip in and out of a sport and get their enjoyment with it. We need to look at the cost effectiveness of it. We need to find ways that maybe people don't have to own their own vehicles, that they can lease them, that they can arrive and drive. We've seen a lot of that exploding in the karting arena, for example. So we've got to be innovative also with the technology. We've now published our electric rules and vehicle rules and regulations. So if you want to go out and build an electric prototype vehicle to go and do hill climbing, the rules and regulations are there. If you want to convert a Tesla S and go off and do sprints, the regulations are there. So we're embracing the new technologies. We can't get stuck in the past. We need to make sure that we move forward and that we innovate. And then final slide, governance and regulations. As I said, it's there, it's the bedrock of what we do. All sports federations were created on the basis of creating a rule book so that everybody knew how they could compete against each other. But rules and regulations need to evolve. And one of the things we're looking at is the potential to rewrite the Blue Book over the next 2 or 3 years. It's a massive task. We need to make sure that everything continues to be joined up in its logic and its flow and its thinking and the cross-referencing. But we're working with Richard Norbury, who's the chair of the Rules Committee, and also other members of our own in-house legal team, to really look at whether or not we can streamline some of the rules and regulations. You know, one of the things that we get as feedback is that our sport, which by its nature is very technical and it has to have a lot of safety measures, but the bureaucracy around it and the rules and regulations around it can at times be daunting, particularly for new people coming into the sport. And we'll be talking also a little bit later on about reducing the paperwork, streamlining things, and all of the good that has come out of the pandemic through the last 12 months that has forced us to do certain things digitally can also help us to streamline the rules and regulations and the processes around that. So moving on, sustainability. There's kind of two meanings of this word. Sustainability in the sense of we need to sustain the sport in the long term, make sure that our sport is sustainable, but also in the sense of environmentally sustainable. And this section really is talking about the latter. In September 2020, we launched the Environmental Sustainability Toolkit for the clubs, and that toolkit is available through the Learning Hub. I hope everybody on the call has accessed the Learning Hub. If you haven't done, there is a tremendous amount of information in the Learning Hub, and in fact that is going to be growing and growing over the coming months. It's something which is absolutely pivotal to our information exchange with all of our different stakeholders. This allows the clubs, even at grassroots level, to take steps towards implementing an environmental management system linked to their event operations. And clubs can become accredited so that they can align themselves with the FIA's best practice principle. And we've got a couple of clubs working on this already, and there'll be a dedicated webinar for clubs in February. So please look out for information around that. We'd love to get you engaged with this. We think this is really, really important. Again, it's all very well the governing body having a sustainability strategy, but it's everybody on the ground running the events, managing the events where it really matters. So please engage with this and let's move forward with it. We've been successful in getting the FIA Sports Grant submission to support our sustainability application. And that's really good news because we can fast track this with the funding from the FIA. Next slide, please. We've also set up a new sustainability committee. It's chaired by David Lapworth. Many of you will know. He's also chair of the technical committee. And David has got a passionate drive to look at innovative ways in which we can change our behavior and our systems and our processes to make sure that we have really implemented sustainability from the top down across the whole of the board. Next slide, please. Equality, diversity and inclusivity or inclusion, EDI, is something that I think we're all very conscious that in our society, the inclusivity of a much broader demographic and diverse range of people and backgrounds is something that really makes up our society today. We have a very, very mixed community, and that needs to apply also to our sport. We have grown up as a sport with quite a distinct demographic, and I think that it is absolutely beholden on us to invite people into the community that perhaps haven't historically seen it as naturally somewhere that they would feel at home. And to do that, we've set up a new structure with a new committee structure, which is focused on equality, diversity and inclusivity. I won't go through all of these terms of reference. You'll be getting these slides afterwards, so by all means read them afterwards. But essentially what we're doing is to set up, and if you go to the next slide please, a series of subcommittees and working groups. At the top of that we have the Equality, Diversity and Inclusivity Committee, which is chaired by Catherine Bonmuir. Catherine is the CEO of the W Series, which is the female-only single-seater series I'm sure you know all about, and is moving on next year to be on the same race card as Formula One internationally. I think they've got 6 rounds with Formula One, so the profile of that series is going to continue to grow, which is extremely exciting. And then underneath that we have 4 specialty committees. So the Ethnic Diversity Group was chaired by Mike Magumby, LGBTQ by Richard Morris, Disability and Accessibility, I'm sure you know Natalie McGloin very well, and Women in Motorsport, another of our main board directors, Helen Bashford-Malky, is chairing Women in Motorsport. I also sit on the FIA's Women in Motorsport Commission, so we have got very good connections there. And I think broadly, Motorsport UK and the MSA before has done a lot in the area of women in motorsport with Dare to be Different with Susie Wolf, which is then morphed into Girls on Track, which is the FIA's naming and branding around that. And we continue to invest in this area, but there's a long way to go. You know, we still only have around 10% of our competition license holders are female. And as with all of these different categories here, there is absolutely no reason, for example, now with the technology available, that disabled drivers should not be able to compete directly with able-bodied drivers. And that's a wonderful aspect of our sport, is that it is a level playing field. It's completely gender neutral. There's absolutely no reason why whether male or female can't compete together. And I think this is a really exciting area for us to embrace, because of all the sports out there, we don't need to have separate approaches to any of these different areas. It needs to be completely inclusive and completely equal. And that extends to all of our officials and our marshals and all of our communities of volunteers, that we want to welcome in a much more inclusive approach across the board. So there'll be more coming down the line. This is just the beginning of this process, but I just wanted to update you and let you know that we're taking this very seriously, making a lot of investment in our time and energy to make sure that we are absolutely reflective of the broader society in the UK. Rally GB, well, I probably could talk about this for quite some time. It's a very complex subject, and I think it's highly emotive. You know, I mean, I certainly grew up all my life involved with rallying, grew up in a family involved in World Championship rallying, and so for me, not to have a round of the World Rally Championship in the UK last year and this year is personally very distressing. I mean, it's something that David Richards as well, you know, ex-World Rally Champion in 1981, takes very, very personally. And so I don't think anybody should be under any illusions that we have a very, very strong commitment to get the WRC back in the UK. But we can't ignore the facts. I mean, 2020 was a victim of COVID. And I think, as we all know, although when we decided to cancel the rally in June, some people felt it was premature, but of course, the country was in lockdown in November, and it was proven to be in the correct move. 2021 is a little bit different, but not so much. COVID has had a massive effect on the whole calendar around the world. And what has resulted from that is that the teams actually have restricted the number of rounds that the FIA and the WRC promoter can run to 12 this year. And there were already 10 events, 10 countries around the world that had existing contracts. So there are very few slots that were available. And the challenge came when the WRC promoter really wanted to push as many of the events as they could into the back of the season. And therefore the autumn suddenly became extremely crowded. And we were given a slot in August, which in all honesty was probably, from their perspective, aimed more at Northern Ireland than it was at Wales at that moment in time. And the problem with an August date for Wales is that the hotels are already full, the restaurants are full, assuming obviously that there's no nationwide restrictions going on. And therefore it becomes quite difficult to persuade the Welsh government that an August date has got an economic benefit for their country. So all of those things came together, and frankly, we reached a point with the FIA and with the WRC promoter just around the beginning of January, where we had to let that date go because they had other events that could make their commitments and had got the economic backing from their partners that we simply didn't have. So it's a really, really unfortunate set of circumstances. However, it is giving us the opportunity to really look at the format of the event, the potential venues for the event, and all of us who've been involved in the sport all of our lives know only too well that although the rally has been in Wales for the last 21 years, of course, for decades before that, it travelled around the countryside and has been present in all 4 UK home nations. And we embrace that, and we'd like to explore the potential for it to be in other countries and other regions and other localities again in the future. And also look at the format of it, look at ways in which we can innovate and ways in which we can bring it back. But the one message I would give you is that we are firmly committed to finding a solution and getting the WRC back in the UK. It's a really, really important thing for us to do. And then finally, penultimately, but Brexit. Just talking about the impact of Brexit for movements between the UK and the EU. Clearly the agreement with the EU came very late in the day, very, very late in the day. And not just for motorsport, but across pretty much all of industry, they are still working through some of the basic principles of how's this going to work. And I think that over the coming 2 or 3 months, a lot of this will get clearer. The fact that we're in a national lockdown and the fact that our borders are getting more and more restricted is probably quite helpful for us. And it's also our closed season. There's not a huge amount of competition going on in Europe at the moment either. And therefore, it's probably made our lives a little bit easier at the moment as we work through some of these details. But at the bottom of this slide, you can see on the right-hand side, we have got a Brexit checker, which is our link to all of the information that we do have. We're in frequent and regular contact with the government. And when we have updates, when we get more knowledge, we pass those through and we post them onto our website. The things to consider are applications for carnets for the temporary export of cars and equipment. Trailers may require registration. If you haven't got a global health insurance card, I would strongly recommend that you do that, not just for professional travel, but you'll also need that for domestic and for pleasure. Insurance green cards for cars. Passports will have an extended requirement for expiry dates. International driving permits are going to be required, and GB stickers coming back on your car. So the key advice is to plan ahead. I mean, this is clearly still being worked out, and I very much hope that by the time that the season really kicks off in the early summer, an awful lot of these things will have become a lot clearer, and we will have the advice on our website on how to deal with it. And then finally, BISTA. So I think everybody's aware we have had in the pipeline to move to BISTA after some 32 years at Colnbrook next to Heathrow. Not the most accessible place to get to, moving to Bicester is going to be very much in the heartland of the Motorsport Valley, and the transportation links for Bicester are much improved than trying to get down to Colnbrook, and certainly public transport for those that want to fly in, maybe from Scotland or from Northern Ireland. The train services into Bicester are excellent, and of course the M40 motorway just passing by our front door. It's also just culturally, environmentally, it's a wonderful place to be. It's filled with enthusiasts of classic cars, automobiles, and they have got some very exciting plans for new technology businesses in there. So they're going to be inviting high-tech businesses into a new business park that they've now got planning permission for. There's very exciting plans for inviting vehicle manufacturers to have experiential centres there. And they've got this huge airfield. And if you go to the next slide, for those that are not familiar with the site, when you go to the Bicester Scramble, which again, if you haven't been to it, I thoroughly recommend it. It's great fun. That really only takes place in that little tiny corner down at the bottom end, which is the old World War II buildings. And the entire site is absolutely vast, and you can see they have a whole range of future plans there. If you go onto their website, they've got all sorts of fly-through videos and explanations about what their vision for the space is. And of course, that gives us a tremendous opportunity. They're working with a number of specialists, including circuit designers, to design and build kart tracks there, and also sprint circuits. So we can find ourselves in the midst of a wonderful environment where we can do all sorts of great things, including training and learning and development. Rescue and recovery teams can have equipment stored there. And we are down our new headquarters in the bottom right-hand corner. You can see the new technical site, and that's a new build of 10 buildings built in the same style as the World War II buildings. The planners were quite specific about that, but they are brand new buildings. Just go to the next slide, and this is our new building. So it's an industrial type unit with a number of other new builds around it. And if you go to the next slide, you can see the inside of it. It's very much the sort of warehouse style. And the final slide, which we're now in the process of kitting out with some offices and some office equipment. So we're moving in there in the next couple of weeks, notwithstanding the lockdown. Obviously, we're not going to be fully populating the site until the lockdown lifts, but we will operationally be moving from Colnbrook to Bicester. The sale of Colnbrook is underway at the moment, and basically the sale of Colnbrook is paying for the new building at Bicester. So the organisation ends up with a freehold building in Bicester, which is great news. So we secure our long-term future in Bicester in an entirely more relevant location and in a new building. So I think that will be a really big step forward, and hopefully this time next year we'll be able to welcome people to the building for training sessions and for meetings and committee meetings. And that really concludes all of my section. I'm going to hand back to James. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Hugh, for that. Just a reminder to our participants in the call today, if you've got a query, please do pop it in the Q&A box. If you raise your hand, we can't respond to those, I'm afraid. So do pop your queries in the Q&A box for us, and we'll do our best to get back to you as soon as possible. So I'm going to hand over to John Ryan now, who's going to lead us through a look at the past, present and future of motorsport under this pandemic that we've all been experiencing.
Thank you, James, and good morning, ladies and gentlemen. Big thank you for joining us today. It's a little bit strange having not seeing you all in person over, spending over 20 years going to seminars across the country. It was one of the, I'll call it a social occasion almost, to come and meet you all during the course of the year. So we look forward to getting back to some sort of normal in the future. We can all meet again, but hopefully this is the next best thing. Just to let you know, if you haven't met me before, my name's John Ryan. I'm the Technical, Sporting and Safety Director at Motorsport UK, but I'm sure I'm familiar to most of you. Just to repeat the big thank you to all your help and, over the last year, but, throughout actually as a sport. You are fantastic volunteers and officials. I have to say that with all the interactions we have with the FI and other governing bodies, I'm very proud to say that I think we've got the best, or I know we've got the best officials in the world. You guys make us proud, and a really big thank you. Without yourselves, we wouldn't have a sport, and we really do appreciate all the hard efforts you give to the sports. So just going over a few bits, I'm going to run over a little bit of a timeline of what we've been doing over the last year for COVID-19 and how we got brought the sport back. Where this is quite important, although we're probably repeating some information you've seen before, is just to give you an understanding of the process and how we'll probably continue to actually tackle these problems. We've had to be very dynamic. We've had a great deal of assistance with all sorts of people. But what's very important is we try and stay positive. Safety comes first, of course, but we must stay positive. But we're going to restart again. We've got a bit of experience now. First time, it was quite a shock to the system. We've never experienced anything like it. Even when we had the foot and mouth, as I'm sure many of you remember, we came to a gentle slowdown and stop then. There was nothing like we had at this point in time. What is very important is making sure that we are socially being seen as acceptable. Considerations must be given on non-essential travel. When non-essential travel is not permitted, we should not be running motorsport. The same with the burden to the hospitals. Motorsport in its nature can sometimes have some risk associated to it, and we can't burden the hospitals if there's any risk of them not being able to take in any patients from our events. And of course, the overnight accommodation. So just going back, so on the 17th of March, we suspended permits. This was just before the government actually came into a lockdown. But in Motorsport House, we were very concerned by the movements of the virus. We've seen over in Europe, it's accelerated very quickly. And it was obvious that, you know, mass gatherings, etc., would not be acceptable. So the first sort of question was, is it a case of just closing up things to spectators or limit spectators? The decision was made on the 17th of March to actually suspend all permits, but we did not know how long this was going to go on for. We knew that we had to go and help the community, so we started off with the Club Continuity Fund, which we had actually £1 million set aside to help people, and that covered over, you know, over around 20 odd clubs in total across the country, across the UK, should I say. From England, Scotland, Northern Ireland, Wales, and across all the different disciplines of the sports. If we can carry on to the next slide. What was very important now is actually trying to build up the guidance, is working with different groups of people. And many of you actually on the session today were involved with part of that planning. So we worked with various stakeholders, worked with various government departments, things like the DCMS, Sports Scotland, Government Wales, etc., in Northern Ireland, and also, you know, talking to the clubs and everything in the Channel Islands and the Isle of Man. But it's trying to actually get some good advice of how we should actually tackle this problem and how could we restart motorsport. We're also talking to lots of committee members, the stakeholders such as the circuits, the venues, and everyone's been fantastic in trying to join with various online meetings, webinars, etc., to get those bits and pieces together. The important part is the collaboration, and it was very important that we actually sought medical advice. Our own Dr. Paul Trafford, who's with us today, I was on the phone probably on a daily basis or online meetings, trying to get advice from, you know, straight from the medical professionals, you know, trying to make sure we follow the advice from Public Health England and also the World Health Organization as well in certain aspects. So just when we started assessing the issues, we started looking at the government's advice, the typical things about social distancing, social gatherings, the hygiene measures, washing your hands for 20 seconds, the medical impacts as well, and also being mindful of vulnerable people. We then listed a number of items that we felt as Motorsport UK, we could actually offer advice. There's a number of areas which were important for the organiser and venues to actually implement as well. And I think one of the key things was actually identifying that, you know, not being able to have mass gatherings, spectators was certainly going to be a no-no. So this is a bit like, I suppose, a risk chart. We created a 3 different scenarios, and we still haven't reached scenario 3 other than for a period in places like Guernsey. But scenario 1's pretty much where we've been since the restarts, where we've got these limitations on social distancing, gatherings, the very high hygiene measures, and no spectators. We did see some events have so what we've called day visitors, but they're separated from the bubble. So as far as we're concerned, from the Motorsport UK permit, it is within the sport, that's a sporting bubble, and there's no spectators. Everyone has to be accounted for with regards to the self-declaration and signing on. So if we can just go on a little bit further, please. So one of the complications for us was actually trying to come up with advice for all the different disciplines. You see here, we've got autocross, auto tests, circuit racing, cross country. If we go on to the next slide, drag racing, hill climb, karting, rally cross, rallying, sprints, trials. And then there's lots of derivatives, all these different aspects. And of course, not forgetting volunteering itself. So trying to manage those different areas, we had to have a look at what the main risks were. So if we go to the next slide, please. So having a real risk analysis of looking what the current risks were, or the main points that we needed to address as an ASN, and what the operational targets would be. And we used a color-coded system here. We wanted to achieve green across the board, but some areas are beyond our control, such as reputational risk, financial risk, and multiple occupation of vehicles. If we go on to the next slide, please. This is an example of one of the sections we just listed on that table. So the availability of officials, which is relevant to yourselves. And we were mindful that we're going to have a bit of restriction because some people are shielding and may not feel confident about coming out so soon in July. So we put a restriction on the event permits. We said it during July, we would keep them to less than half of what we had the year before. No British Championships to take place, to try and avoid the mass transportation across the country, but also to make sure we didn't have to burden officials. Now, we did put a survey out to the officials, and we were pleased to hear that actually 72% of them said they were ready to restart on the 4th of July, which was a greater percentage than we anticipated. So people geared themselves up, but a lot of people felt, so it was 94% felt ready to begin for the 4th of July because they understood the safety measures, those people who said they were ready. What was very important is to actually understand how we could do jobs more remotely. You can see the age demographic here with the stewards, clerks and scrutineers tend to be of the more experienced people. And we were mindful that some people would actually be shielding, especially some people in the over 70s at the time would be less likely to want to actually go out to events. On the medical side and the rescue, recovery, etc., you tend to have a younger age demographic, which was fairly helpful of obviously trying to make sure we had those key people attending events. But in this case, we were able to actually make sure that the operational risk was turned to a green, which was very key. So going on to the actual guidance documents, we spoke about 11 different disciplines plus the volunteering. We felt that some of them are very similar in the way they're operated, but we actually then funneled them down to 5 different sets of working documents. It's very important you do keep watching the size of these. Read them. If you only read them from the very beginning, back when we first published them back in May, they have changed and you need to keep up to date. I will talk about the extra sections we have for all the different nations. And if you go to the website, you will find them all on here. So if you can go to the next slide, please, James. So here we've got the separate guidance documents for race, rally, speed, club sport and karting. And then you've got the Q&A as well, which is most important. You've also got the additional guidance documents. So if you're a clerk, steward, scrutineer, you'll have different documents which are applicable to yourselves. And there's some new documents for new types of people, such as the COVID-19 officers. These documents can all be found in this section, and they often do have some updates. We are looking to continue to actually develop them further. So please keep a close eye out, and we do try and keep you informed when things have been updated. So going back to a timeline, we'd obviously said that we're going to start now on the 4th of July following government guidance, etc. But we had to get geared up, ready for that. We were mindful that PPE was very hard to come by. So we actually found the central procurements of PPE. We actually spent £50,000 to ensure that we could get Motorsport restarted during July and August to supply all the clubs, rescue personnel, etc. With the equipment they need, including over 10,000 bottles of hand sanitizer at this point, giving advice of how PPE, etc. should be used. everyone made good effects with the use of this PPE. What was very important as well is to make sure that we weren't taking PPE away from the essential medical services socially, and it's really important socially that we, we're seen in a good light. Just while we're talking about the social impacts of motorsports, there's been lots of great things you guys have been doing to help the community. I've seen that people have been, such as Lyddon Hill, operating COVID-19 test centres, and Terry Bateman up at Darley Mall has been running a vaccination centre, helping the community. So some really good stories, and I know that's just a drop in the ocean of some of the bits and pieces that's been going on. So, thank you so much for your help, and I know there's going to be further help being considered to help support St John's. So please keep that going. That's very important. And it was great on the engineering side to see that things like Formula One teams and our racing teams were helping with the production and design of ventilators. So it does put us in a good light, and we want to maintain that goodwill with the community. You made good use of the PPE, which is very important. And just with we carry on, the deployment of the PPE, it was a very short timeline between, if you go to the next slide, please, a short timeline between getting the PPE out and the event starting. So we had lots of people, team members trying to help, and including Tom Williams and Patrick O'Donovan, a World Rally Championship competitor and a rising British Rallycross star, along with our own Hugh Chambers. So everyone was put their hands in to actually help get this deployment of PPE out. I'm going to now hand you over to Paul Trafford, who's going to go over a few basic principles of hygiene and PPE. As I said before, Paul was so important, along with John Atkins and other people from the medical side, to actually help develop our strategy and get things moving. So we can hand you over to Dr. Paul Trafford, and I think we'll go to the next slide. Thank you.
Good morning. I think there's nobody in the world now that doesn't understand the term PPE and knows how to put a mask on and gloves and what protective equipment medical staff are wearing. It was all a little bit complicated when it started. The information being handed out from governments and various bodies that were involved was rather confusing. And we spent a long time sitting down trying to pull something together that actually worked for motorsport and reflected and respected the sort of guidelines from the government, which, as I'm sure you all know, were changing almost daily at some point. So it was quite difficult, but I think it worked well for motor racing. I think everyone was very frightened when it started, including the doctors and the medical staff. I think everyone was a bit apprehensive of how it would work, but I think everyone's got into the routine now. And the principles we started in March are still the same principles of washing your hands. And that involved introducing a lot of personal hand washing gels and hand stations where you could wash on events. Wearing a face mask, and we took the decision fairly early on that these should be compulsory and there would be no waivers and no opt-outs for wearing them. And it's interesting now that the governments are coming round to that thought. There is some controversy over it. Well, are they totally effective? Are they not effective? What sort do you need? But at the end of the day, I think we all have to do what we need to do to try and limit the effects of the virus. And maintaining a space, which is difficult in motorsport because you get so many people wandering up, putting an arm around each other, having a chat, and trying to keep that distance. But it's not just motorsports, the whole of life at the minute where you've got to do that. So people have eventually come round to that. We also advise people should be shielding. So if you're at risk, you shouldn't be coming to motorsport events. We went through how to don and doff, another phrase that has entered the language, how to put on the equipment, how to take it off, and what to do with it when you take it off. We also introduced the COVID medical officer, not just because we thought it was a good idea, but because the government insisted it was a requirement for larger events. And we said where there's a chief medical officer, they would act as the COVID medical officer. For very large events such as the Grand Prix, you have to have a separate COVID medical officer. And their role isn't really to maintain the paperwork and keep all the lists, which is the role of the COVID officer. The COVID medical officer's role is merely to have plans in place if somebody is found to have COVID, what to do with them, make sure that the medical side is working properly. And somebody asked a question about the strain on the NHS, and part of the COVID medical officer role is to check locally with the hospitals, with the emergency services. If your local hospital is shut and cannot take admissions, you can't be running an event unless there are other facilities. And you need to engage with the emergency services and the NHS and say, can we run this event? Can you cope with it? And they'll be quite honest with you and tell you. And if they say no, the area is in crisis, then you really haven't got an alternative. We don't want to put strain on the ambulance service. So again, talk to them. And we said, where possible, you should have an ambulance capability to take your own patients to a hospital rather than having to pull a frontline NHS ambulance out. So there are considerations. It's not impossible. It's worked at a lot of events last year. It will start to work again. I think probably not for another couple of months before it starts to unroll. And it won't just be like turning a light switch on and we go back to normal. We will unroll slowly, and it will be doing what we've been doing to a greater extent, and then eventually sort of backing off. So please try and respect what we've introduced. We've not done it for fun. It is there to work, and it has been working so far. In the instance at motorsport events, I think as John and Dan will tell you, is fairly low. Thank you.
Okay, thank you, Paul. So yeah, as John had mentioned earlier in the presentation, it was recognised very early on that motorsport would have to make some changes. And one of them changes was that the clubs would need to appoint a COVID-19 officer. The COVID-19 officer has a role before, during and after the event. And we've created several templates to assist in that role, as shown on the screen. The first is a risk assessment, which is shown on the left of the screen, for which clubs will need to update their current risk assessments to include any risks around COVID. You may use the template which we've provided, or if you're a club that already has an existing risk assessment and you want to use that format, then you may do so. You don't need to send them risk assessments into Motorsport UK, but we please do ask that you have them on hand during the event, just in case you get a visit from the police, the health and safety executive, or the environmental health officer who turns up and they would ask which guidance and where the risk assessment is for COVID. And then during the event, the COVID-19 officer's role doesn't end. They would have to attend the event and ensure that the risk assessment and the Motorsport UK guidance are being respected, and then report back to Motorsport UK using the report form, which you can see on the right of your screen. And when filling out this form, we do ask that the COVID-19 officers, put down any issues, however major or minor, which then help other clubs by sharing your experiences, perhaps things that you've come across other clubs haven't thought about yet, and we can assist other clubs in doing so. So it's fairly brief. Obviously, if you have any questions, do put them in the Q&A, and I'll hand you back to John.
Yes, indeed. Thank you, Dan. So just to go back as a continuing review, as of today, we use the form of webinars to great effect actually last year when we got had to try and launch motorsport. We had a number of training sessions across all the different types of officials and the new sort of COVID-19 officers, and we had over 1,000 participants, and this is not including actually the marshals for the Grand Prix, believe it or not. So by having these webinars, you'll see on the chart on the right hand side, it's probably quite hard to see for the writing in small, but the confidence grew from actually at the beginning to the end of the session of what was people felt they could actually get going with the events. So that was very important for us. And the use of actually online meetings has become the norm now for us. I didn't know what Zoom was all about, or Teams at all, back in March, and now it's become a daily tool. I suppose almost your diary gets dictated by it. So we need to make good use of these things. It's very relevant to yourselves as officials as well, to make sure that you do use these good methods of training that doesn't involve, having to travel to places and hopefully occupy some of your free time. So if we can just go to the next slide, please, Sue. So carrying on with the timeline, obviously we got started with the events on the 4th of July, and just give you a reflection on the permits. As we said, we had put a limitation on permits in July last year, so it was less than half of what we had the year before, and that was intentional. But we did see a steady growth, coming into August and September. We still had restrictions in certain parts of the country, parts of the United Kingdom, and in particular in the rally side, it actually did take a bit of time before that was able to come along to the scene. But you did see that there was a gentle growth in confidence. When the events did restart, we tried to make sure that our staff and board members attended pretty much most of the events that took place in July. So there's over 100 events attended by Motorsport UK staff during the first month. And we took on board actually some good ideas from people, because already clubs actually brought in their own COVID-19 officer tab. So we've ended up supplying some ourselves as well. So and it's something that we've actually been asked after yesterday's session if we could actually continue the further supply to clubs. So we'll take that back. We go to the next slide. Part of a restart as well, we've spoken all about the national events, and now some of you will be involved with FI international events, and I'm sure some of you are involved with the British Grand Prix, and they run to a different protocol. There's a lot, I suppose, more heavier on what the requirements were for screening in particular, and Dr. Paul Trafford will talk about the PCR testing and that, which would be required in accordance to Appendix S. FI relaxed the application of Appendix S, so it doesn't actually have to cover all international events, but any FI championship events, it's mandatory. And it's down to the individual countries then to put in any further restrictions if they need to do so. And in the case of, let's say, the British Grand Prix, there's some very close work done with DCMS. But it's very important to understand this is a different measure that, we are dealing with the Grand Prix with a huge number of people within the sporting bubble. So the actual need of testing was far greater. But the reality is, if we'd done PCR testing at national level events, it just would not be practical to get our events underway. But Paul will actually touch on those shortly. So going further forward, in August, we were pleased to see we could get Motorsport restarted in Scotland. During that period, there was, Motorsport did restart in the likes of Wales and that, but there was restriction on numbers, restriction of up to 30 participants. And we'll touch on that a little bit further with Neil Fuller and Ben Taylor, where we've been going with that. Paul mentioned about the evolution of the guidance, that we had more stricter guidance on the face masks in September, and that was very important. Now it's become commonplace. There was a bit of criticism from some people at the beginning, the fact that we had we even said that people had medical exemptions would still have to wear masks in areas they couldn't actually socially distance. So that was very key. Please keep watching the Q&A. And at this point as well, we realised the difficulties some clubs still had with getting face masks. So in October, we actually supplied another 20,000 face masks and another 5,000 bottles of hand sanitizer. Going on a little bit of a deviation from the main guidance, but we've also been asked to help people going to events abroad, and actually our overseas competitors coming to the UK. And that transition is very common, believe it or not. So the DCMS have given national governing bodies the permission to actually give exemption letters to elite sports personnel, including officials. So there is a process that you can follow through the Motorsport UK website. There is an application form, some guidelines. There's an example of a letter here. As I said, it works sort of both ways. What it does allow you to do is actually bypass the quarantine measures when you come back, only to continue your motorsport line of work and to go to a Motorsport UK events. Now, if you're going to a Motorsport UK event, to ensure we offer further protection to our membership when you go to those events, you must do a PCR test if it's within that quarantine period, and that has to be taken 2 days after you arrive back in the UK. Just as a further update from DCMS itself, they've said even now, with the further restrictions that have taken place, that elite sport training and competition is still permitted. So, our professional drivers, etc., can actually still go abroad. But there are some limitations regarding what they need to do. It's very wise, if you are going abroad to any of these events, to actually look at the advice for the Foreign, Commonwealth and Development Office, just to see what the different countries have put in place restrictions. We've got no right to actually give any exemptions for restrictions as you go abroad. That's down to the individual nations. We are talking to some of the ASNs to see what they might have in place, similar to what we have in place with DCMS. But please note, actually, from the 15th of January, if you are going to any events abroad, it's a requirement, it's a mandatory requirement. You must have a negative pre-departure COVID test. And usually that is in the form of a PCR test. Now, you might ask, what happens if you're only going for a day or two? You need to then take the test before you set off from the UK. It has to be within 3 days of you setting back foot on that plane, arriving back in the UK, or the boat, etc., whichever form of transportation you're taking. And that's very key. And from the 18th of January, all the travel corridors where for people places like Dubai, etc., up until recently, you didn't actually have to quarantine when you came back. All those travel corridors are gone. You have to isolate from every country that you come across from overseas. And it's now a 10-day isolation period. There is a method of test and release scheme, which the government, it's on the government website, which is open for all. And that will allow you to shorten that period to 5 days. But that's upon a negative test again, a PCR test, one of the government's recognised companies, and that can't be taken, the test cannot be taken until the 5th day on your departure of the country concerned. Now, working with the other governments is very important. I know sometimes there's a feeling that the concentration is always on England and not the rest, and that's not the case. We probably spent more time working with the other nations than we have with England itself. It's fair to say in England with DCMS, they probably have a lot more in the way of resource and that to actually manage these issues. So the advice was more free-flowing from DCMS compared to some of the other nations. And it's fair to say some of the other nations, we've actually been trying to help educate them what our sport is. You know, it is a complicated sport for people to gather. And a lot of the nations are probably dealing with 50 or 60 different types of sports and trying to actually understand how they should apply guidance. So in the case of Wales, we actually, we're making progress. Back last September, we actually had a test event up at Anglesey with up to 100 participants. And it was very unfortunate, a few days after that, there was some more national restrictions in place. So it put us back. So we continue to only have 30 participants. And we envisage that's going to be the case when we do come out of unlocking at the first part. In Scotland, we did make progress. They had a different way of doing things. We had a limitation of number of people in each bubble, but you could have multiple bubbles at the events. But the one restriction we do have, unfortunately, is you can't have multiple occupancy in the vehicles. And our own Pete will be talking about that shortly. If we can go to the next slide, please.
Just before we move on, John, we've had a question. We've been liaising with governments. Have we been liaising with landowners, for example, the MOD, on opening up venues?
Yes, we have. We're in constant contact with the MOD. They're taking a very strict line following the government guidance on gatherings in general. So even with the exemptions that DCMS have given us, they're just reflecting what the governments have said on gatherings. So it really has shut down in the main most of the MOD land areas. So, you know, it's had a big effect. You know, for instance, in karting, Forest Edge is a typical example. It's caused problems. But we are in constant communication with the different sort of landowners, whether it's the circuit or the MOD, of how we can try and get things moved forward. But that is the unfortunate thing that they've got you know, common policy across the board.
Thank you.
So, as I said, there are sort of different levels of restrictions. I will talk about the channel lines and that in a short while, once we've actually seen some of the videos and speeches from some of the panel members. But we did have that further lockdown in November, and we came back to motorsport in December. There was a couple of events that continued in November last year, such as the British Touring Cars, British GT, and events in Scotland still continued in the channel lines, etc. So there was still a trickle of events taking place, but in the main, events did come to a stop. And then, of course, on the 4th of July, it's had a big effect on most people across the board. And it's just a reflection on the permits. During the end of last year, you see the dramatic drop in November. In December, I think a lot of clubs and championships, when speaking to them, decided to actually push their events, you know, back to 2021. I'm now going to pass over to James and to Nikki Moffat, who will be actually talking about how the restart of motorsport and COVID-19 has had an effect in Northern Ireland. And I'll come back to you shortly after when we've had a break. Thank you very much.
Thank you, John. And yes, so I'd like to ask Nikki Moffat to join us now to reflect on how the pandemic has affected the sport in Northern Ireland. Nikki.
Thank you very much, James, and thanks, John, for the information that you've given. Maybe I could just start off with a couple of general points, please. Managing COVID across the UK hasn't been easy for the Motorsport UK executives, and as John has indicated, that's because each of the devolved administrations and the offshore islands, not to forget, have issued significantly different criteria for everyone to meet. So I would start by passing my thanks to all those working at Motorsport UK and delivering the guidance to the clubs, the officials and the competitors, and along with providing PPE for all those events that have taken place. The issue of the generic restart guidance documents, combined with the monitoring, the continued monitoring of that government advice from each area, has definitely allowed the executives to issue specific advice. Now, John has indicated the Welsh and the Scottish one, which was on the screen. But I do know that there have been many hours of Zoom calls and negotiations pertinent to every area, and indeed including discussions with several local government ministers. From my viewpoint, having travelled across the country for events during 2020 when they were allowed, I would like to thank the clubs, the officials, the competitors and marshals who were all working together as one team to deliver events and embrace the management of COVID controls very successfully. I mean, the introduction of the online sign-on, the self-declarations, the incident management controls, which we'll talk about later, and generally paperless events has worked very well, with much of that destined to be the future. Regarding the offshore islands, not to forget Isle of Man, Jersey and Guernsey, for example, there have been tighter controls against COVID, where the spread of the virus has not been so rapid and has allowed some events to be permitted for residents. However, unfortunately, I have been told in the last few days that there are some tighter lockdowns in the islands at the moment. However, bearing that in mind, all those island clubs and events have diligently followed the generic Motorsport UK protocols and advice regarding the online declarations, etc. So it's not as if they have been doing anything different than we expect every club when they are allowed to run events. Now to Northern Ireland, through the Association of Northern Ireland Car Clubs and the separate company 2 and 4 Wheels, we have a very positive relationship with our local government departments, with Sport Northern Ireland and also the Northern Ireland Sports Forum. The forum manage the day-to-day liaison with government for all sport in the province and regularly issue updated guidance following any decisive actions which have been taken by the Northern Ireland Executive in Stornham. And like every other devolved area, we're now under tighter lockdown controls, which were due to end in February. However, just this week, they have been reviewed, and Northern Ireland is now in an extended lockdown until the 5th of March, which is another 6 weeks. That means that no events can take place, but more importantly than that, no public relations work will be possible for clubs planning for future events. And there's a very important thing to remember here: the public perception of motorsport is the key to our future. One issue that we were not able to resolve was the allowance for 2 competitors or even officials from outside a household in a car. And despite positive work on this front in November, we were hit by tighter controls, removing that opportunity and the issue of specific guidance. And that position has not changed, despite being one of our local priorities, as almost all rallying will require 2 persons in a car throughout the event in some way. Thankfully, during July, our local negotiations resulted in some events being given the green light. No spectators, and allowed for controlled bubbles in terms of those officials and competitors at the venues. We did succeed in running several combined race and long circuit kart meetings at Kirkeston, with about 60 competitors at each event. The Northern Ireland Sprint Championship restarted at 2 separate venues, each attracting 100 entries. And one club also ran a rally time trial, which had 65 entries. Apart from that, I'm aware that karting events resumed. And for example, the Ulster Vintage Car Club ran at least one vintage auto test. So overall, the COVID guidelines were respected, and all these events ran successfully with no evidence of any increased spread of the disease. It would be wrong to indicate that everybody else was sitting at home waiting for COVID to disappear. And many clubs took on the technology and communication channels such as Zoom and Microsoft Teams. There were numerous tabletop rallies, online quizzes, and these were all well supported. And the association and a number of clubs are now used to managing meetings from this online platform. Just no face-to-face meetings allowed at this time. So thank you to everyone. Trust you enjoy the rest of the seminar and get the benefit from that. And I'll pass back to James. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Nikki. I'm going to pass over now to Neil Fuller, who is the chair of the Clerks and Stewards Advisory Group, and someone who you may recognise from being at the old-fashioned, as it will be now, old-fashioned face-to-face sessions that we normally run. Over to you, Neil.
Thank you, James. Good morning, all, and thank you all for giving up your Sunday morning to sit in with this webinar with us. As James says, it seems quite strange that I'm sat here looking at the screen rather than being stood in front of a room with 60 odd people, but there you are. It does remind us of the snow in Donington. I think that was 2 years ago, James, isn't it, where still a few hardy souls managed to get to the seminar. So, but there you are, at least we're all in the warm. I'm going to look at Wales really from both a negative and a positive, because I believe that we should leave on a positive. So if we start with the negatives, so during 2019, to just put you into perspective, Motorsport UK records indicate that they issued 300 plus permits for events across Wales. If you do your sums, that works out around about 25 events in all disciplines per month throughout the year. For an example, 2020, which we all know was a testing year for us all, Motorsport UK issued just 70 permits. And that, again, that was across all disciplines and for all events in Wales. And that equates to 6 events a month. And you can see that's a considerable drop, with the majority of these permits actually being issued between January and March before we went into the national lockdown. With regard to COVID-19, the Welsh Assembly Government has been very stringent with their rules and approach to containing the spread of the virus. Consequently, at the moment, we're not allowed to organise any event with more than 30 people in attendance. And we also have the restriction of 2 people from different households in a car, which is also not allowed. As you can imagine, this has severely curtailed the majority of motorsport events in Wales. With the majority of our large events taking place on private land, the landowners are following the advice of the Welsh Assembly Government. And that's quite interesting that someone else from in the country has just brought that up on one of the questions, question and answer things. And basically, the landowners are following the advice of the Welsh Assembly Government. So if you think of NRW, if you think of MOD and whatever, they're just following the rules from our government. And consequently, there's nothing taking place on private land. And that's the same for our 2 fixed venues in Anglesey and at Pembrey. Both our Welsh race circuits in 2020 have had no organised motorsport as such with them. And then finally, non-essential travel to and from Wales for a competitor is actually not allowed at the moment under law during this lockdown. It's due to be reviewed on the 29th of January. It's renewed, I believe, in law every 2 to 3 weeks in Wales. But I think we'll all agree that there's going to be no change. So basically, nothing is happening as we speak. If we look at the positives then, motorsport clubs have adapted to work within the COVID-19 rules. And it's good to see what clubs have actually achieved during the past 12 months or so. Like today, clubs are now communicating in a virtual world. We're keeping in touch through quizzes, guest speakers, with the likes of Zoom and Microsoft Teams meetings. Motorsport has taken place because, as I said, we have actually had 70 permits issued, with clubs organising events where numbers can be strictly controlled, easily, such as auto solos and auto tests. On the 12th of December 2020, 4 North Wales clubs came together to organise a forest rally, but again, by law, that was limited to just 15 cars. This was to show the outside world that as a sport, we could organise an event safely and within the COVID-19 regulations that were in place in Wales. The whole event was a great success, was run safely within COVID-19 rules, and most importantly, it was good to see 4 clubs working together to organise the event. But very much like Northern Ireland, virtually straight away, we went into another lockdown afterwards. Clubs will continue to plan for the future, and I'm sure that clubs will embrace the new regulations, both nationally and from the devolved governments, which will allow them to once again organise events that can be run safely for all. Thank you, James.
Thank you very much, Neil. Now, please say we've got a couple of videos for you. Firstly, from Peter Will, who is the chair of Regional Committee and also chair of the Scottish Association of Motorsports Clubs.
Hello everyone. As soon as Motorsport UK reached agreement on COVID protocols with UK government, they engaged with Sport Scotland to apply them north of the border. With some minor variations, this happened and events resumed. The one major sticking point is that the Scottish Government are not willing to allow 2 people from different households in the same car, even with mitigation in place. A number of clubs worked hard within these protocols to run COVID-safe events across single occupant disciplines. We saw race and speed events at Knockhill. I was steward at one of these and was impressed with everything done to make them compliant. Touring cars ran at Knockhill, but under the elite sports arrangements. Clubs put on cross-country trials and auto tests, and I want to commend everyone involved for what they did to make this happen. But other clubs found it impossible to meet all the requirements. Other than Superlap at Knockhill, there were no speed events. For venues like Doon, Forestburn and Kames, 2 metre distance in the paddock is a challenge, and the option of limiting entry numbers has a serious impact on financial viability. This is coupled perhaps with these events attracting a slightly older cohort of participants. There were of course no stage rallies or road rallies, not even touring assemblies were allowed. Getting fully back up and running will require us to address at least 5 separate issues. My assumption is that geographic COVID level restrictions will remain in place for the foreseeable future. This means that travel limits will apply. Specifically, travel into or out of level 3 or 4 local authority areas will not be allowed. Sports participation is unlikely to be included as an essential travel reason. I also expect the requirement for people to keep 2 metres distant to remain for some time. The points I made earlier about specific venues will not go away. If and when spectators are allowed, I expect these to be limited and restricted. Last year, some clubs cancelled events because of a wider concern about public perception. There's a widely shared view that our sport will not look good if it's seen to be going ahead when other social activities are not allowed. And finally, I promised to return to car sharing. In early December, SAMSC and Motorsport UK were actively engaged with Sport Scotland on this matter and were making really good progress, constructing a case to present to the relevant government decision makers. While nothing is guaranteed, I had a degree of confidence that we might get the go-ahead for rallies, perhaps from March. But with the additional restrictions announced around Christmas, we decided it was not the right time to press ahead with this. We're now working towards getting this up and running again, and I hope to report progress on it at some point soon. Thank you.
Peter Will there, and Peter is actually joining us today on our panel. So if you've got any questions relating to motorsport in Scotland or anything that Peter just said there, then please do pop them in the Q&A, and I'm sure he'll provide an answer for you. Likewise with Nikki and with Neil as well. And then finally today, before we go to a break, I've got a short video from, if I press the right button, from Jersey. We've got Formula 1 driver or ex-Formula 1 driver and current Formula 1 driver steward Derek Warwick, who's a member of Safety and Race Committee.
Good morning, welcome. My name is Derek Warwick, and I'm here to talk a little bit about Motorsport UK and how they helped us achieve our season in Jersey for the Jersey Kart Club. For sure, without the help of John Ryan and everybody at Motorsport UK, we wouldn't have started early. We did start the beginning of March, and that allowed us to get our full season in. So it was quite amazing that we were able to do that. We created 4 bubbles within the club: the junior drivers, the senior drivers, all the officials, and the marshals. So everybody was wearing gloves, everybody was using sanitizer and mask, obviously. And we made sure we worked in those bubbles by expanding from the paddock for some of the drivers and teams into various fields around us so that we could keep that separation, which was important because obviously we didn't want any positive cases of COVID within our kart club. So I'd like to thank John Ryan and Motorsport UK, and in particular our own COVID officer, who made sure that we all complied and worked within that criteria. I'd also like to talk about Motorsport UK's exemption letter that they arranged with the government to allow our drivers, engineers, mechanics, important people for race teams basically, to travel the world and definitely Europe to be able to come back and able to self-isolate without the 14-day period. So they all had to work under certain criteria that was laid down by this exemption, and touch wood, it worked very well, and everybody was able to finish their seasons, do races all around the world because of this exemption letter. So again, thank you Motorsport UK, and let's have a good session now, and like I started off, keep safe, keep positive, and let's have a good 2021. Thank you.
Derek Warwick there. I'm very thankful to Derek for his time and providing us with that video. Well, welcome back, and I hope you have all managed to get yourselves a cup of tea or cup of coffee to warm you up on this cold day, so we can get started again with the rest of the presentation. Now, I said before the break that I will be showing you an interview with Ben Taylor. As I say, a few days ago, I managed to sit down with Ben, virtually, of course, to actually speak to him about some of the ways that the British Automobile Racing Club's BARC have been affected in the pandemic, and what his thoughts are for the future. So I will play that now for you. Hello, Ben. Thank you very much for joining us today. I think we jump straight to the first question, if we can. The pandemic has, of course, had a massive effect on organising clubs across the whole of the UK. But how has the pandemic affected the events, the championships that the BARC specifically organise?
Yeah, hi James, and hi everybody that's there this weekend giving up your time. I wish I could see you in person, but this is the next best thing. This is probably the view that everyone's got used to in the last 9 months, is that of a Zoom screen and an old man on it. So that's me. Well, yeah, I think the first thing to say for me is that it's amazing what's been achieved last year in the end, because we crammed effectively a racing season into 3 months. 11 event. We ran 11 racing events out of the 23 we were scheduled to run last year. We also managed to put together a 9-round calendar of the BTCC instead of 10. So rescuing part of a season last year was actually nothing short of a miracle. Everyone worked really hard to pull it all together. I think it probably illustrates the sheer bloody mindedness of the motorsport community to overcome the challenges that were faced. And it's probably fair to say that, you know, it's thanks to everybody, those on the meetings, those there this weekend. It's all right. Don't worry, it's only a dog. Listen, this is what we've all been doing. Don't stop the recording. This is real life. We've got children interrupting. I've got children interrupting Zoom calls and home learning and everything like that. So listen, don't worry about the dog. That's the least of the worries. I was just going to say, I think, firstly, thanks to everybody from the clerks, the stewards, the scrutineers, the timekeepers, you know, everybody that's probably going to be on these calls today, and all of their friends and all the people that did it with them, for the effort that they made in order to make some sort of sport possible in 2020. There's no doubt that it was financially devastating. You know, we lost, as a racing club, we lost 65% of our turnover last year. That has hurt us immensely, but we're still going. We're still going, and hopefully we've got some optimism about 2021. The biggest victims last year for me were the venues, the permanent venues. Now, I know that no one's ever going to shed any tears for Jonathan Palmer, but Jonathan and MSV and us with our 3 venues and all the other fixed venues, both race and sprint and hill climb, were, I think, probably the worst affected of all of the parts of the sport last year. Because if you think about it, the competitors got their money back from their clubs. The clubs got their money back from the venues in terms of their track bookings, and the organising clubs got that money back. And it left the venues really with the permanent infrastructure, the fixed costs that go with maintaining that. So the grass still needed cutting, the paint still needed painting, the curbs still needed preparing, and the tarmac still needed looking after, and the power still comes in, and the rates, although we had a bit of a rates holiday, and where appropriate, some of the rent is still due, and so there was no money trickling up to those venues. And again, I'm not trying to pull on people's heartstrings, but I think we all looked after the right people. But it was the venues, I think, that copped for most of the flack last year, and left them in a difficult situation. Hopefully we won't have that repeated for 2021, but fingers crossed.
Absolutely. I mean, obviously Motorsport UK released some guidance to assist clubs in restarting in July, and we obviously worked with key stakeholders, including yourself and Jonathan Palmer as well, to help us to put that guidance together. Can you explain how useful that guidance was in getting yourselves back up and running again?
Yeah, it was. The fact is that last year we were all in uncharted territory. You know, everyone was doing their best and making their own decisions based on the information that they had. What we needed was the dissemination of information and common standards, so that everybody knew what was expected of them, or what was not going to get them into trouble, or how things were meant to be interpreted. And so that's why I think that it was really important that those common standards and that information came out of Motorsport UK. In order to make sure that we all knew what we were doing, and gave us all a degree of comfort that other people weren't either doing it better or doing it worse, or undercutting or over complicating. And furthermore, we didn't want to be wasting money on initiatives or equipment that actually had been considered by people who knew much more than we did. That wasn't actually necessary. So particularly we looked at the medical representatives coming through Motorsport UK, who guided us in terms of what PPE looked like. I mean, I'd never heard of FFP2, FFP3 and the like, and I couldn't possibly have made an informed judgment on what we should have been providing to who. But to have that coming out, that's exactly what the governing body needs to do in terms of its leadership position. I think in some places the changes have moved us forward as a sport. It might not be popular with everybody, but the paperwork and bureaucracy involved in our sport is awful, really. And if one good thing that's come out of the last year is that we've taken sort of a bonfire of red tape or of bureaucracy to some of the paperwork that we've been doing. And the sport needs to go from an analog base to a digital base. And while it might not all have been perfect with scrutineering, signing on, medicals, it's all been a real step forward in challenging what previously had been thought of as being sacrosanct to saying, well, actually, you know what, we can do this without doing paperwork, without having reams and reams of paper everywhere, without asking people to queue up into a very small box every day in line astern to sign a piece of paper that confirms they're there. Yeah, of course, they've all got challenges, and I know that at everybody's people are now working on how we evolve what we did at short-term initiatives last year and how we make those more permanent and more responsible. So scrutineering's clearly got an obvious challenge that there was a lack potentially of scrutiny of the vehicles. But the principle of self-declaration is one that I think has got some merit and means that we don't tie up lots of people doing lots of things. So reducing number of people in race control has also got to be a good thing, because it was getting to be a bit like a house party up there in many events, and most people don't need to be in race control. So I think the rule of 6 has probably been a very good thing in terms of how we manage race control in that kind of area.
Yeah, I think you're right. It's certainly made everybody reassess the processes and the procedures that they've become so well known basically over the years, haven't they, that we do things. And I think it's a fantastic opportunity for us to hit the reset button and reassess what we do going forwards. And I know during the weekday webinars this week that will be discussed a lot as well with the different officials there. So that's an interesting topic. Now, obviously, BARC, you operate venues all over the UK, and of course you operate Pembrey Circuit in South Wales. Wales being an area we know which has been particularly affected by the pandemic. Can you give us an insight into some of the work that's been going on behind the scenes there to get the events back up and running? Yeah,
Wales has been a disaster last year. No, nothing short of a disaster, and I live here. So I have to live with this disaster every day. I suspect, actually, in fairness to the Welsh Government, we will only see in 12 months' time whether they've been overcautious and disastrous, or whether actually they had it right all along. So I wouldn't like to prejudge that. But the upshot of what they've done in Cardiff is that there were no events at all at Anglesey or Pembrey last year, with the exception of the test event that Anglesey ran for 100 people, which was always going to be a success because we know that we can look after people. But it's been a disaster, but not just motorsport. Actually, it's been the same across the whole country. I've sat on a lot of calls every fortnight, actually, with the Welsh Sports Association, which is a representative organisation of governing bodies and leisure providers, both indoor and outdoor, across Wales. And everybody has been pushing and fighting for their sport to be given dispensation to, if not break the rules, get some relaxation on the regulations that Wales has had in place. And nobody's been successful at getting those rules relaxed. So while motorsport, we tend to have a persecution complex because nobody likes us, actually it's no different. The only exceptions have been the professional sports, so football, rugby union, cricket to an extent. What's been particularly frustrating is that we've seen rogue events taking place in Wales. So landowners renting their fields or their forests to motocross events for one day or one weekend, getting 450 competitors, pitching up, making a load of money. And we're playing by the rules, governed by our governing body and adhering to all the regulations and being effectively penalised as a result of doing so, when they don't seem to have any sanction over those sort of rogue events. Where Wales have been better, though, is in the support funding. And while we haven't yet received anything from the Welsh Government, they seem to be, the devolved administrations, and I can't speak for Scotland, but what I've seen from the outside looks like Scotland and Wales are more amenable to supporting industries or sports and venues in their national country with meaningful money, whereas Westminster clearly is worried about, maybe you could say they were more worried about bigger things than whether sport is continuing. So fingers crossed. We've put in for funding from the Welsh Government. I'm not sure what other venues have done in Wales, but that's still ongoing. So we don't expect anything, but if we do get it, it will be a bonus. My sense in Wales is that we may get events in Q2 of this year. I don't think they'll be opening any kind of restriction up before Easter. So provided we can get back to where we almost were in the autumn, which was they introduced a limit of 30 people per event on an outdoor and an indoor basis. And then just as we went into the final lockdown, they increased in the outdoor environment that 30 could be multiple groups of 30 as long as they didn't interact with one another. I think within those regulations we have scope to run normal club race meetings at the circuit, and if we can do that in Q2, that would be good news for us. But certainly I don't see mass gatherings anywhere in Wales in any kind of context before midsummer and possibly into the autumn.
Well, fingers crossed we can get it up and running in Q2, as you say. But what does the rest of 2021 look like for the BARC, wise and event wise?
I'm optimistic for 2021. I guess we have to be, but I'm optimistic for club sport. As I said, I think the spectator sports are going to have still some challenges in terms of whether people can get together into what we call normal crowds. But for club sport, I think we need three things. We need the ban on non-essential travel to be lifted. We need the ability for people to be able to travel from one region of the country to another region without worrying about the various tier levels. And we need permission for people to be able to do overnight stays. And I think if we can get those three things in place, which will probably be amongst the first relaxations of everything that's going on, I think provided we can get that, then there's no reason that club motorsport can't push on behind closed doors, whether that be hill climb or racing or sprinting. I'm sadly not close enough to rallying these days to know exactly where we stand on that one. But I mean, access to venues is clearly going to be a challenge there. But from a BARC point of view, I'm hopeful that it will be better than 2020. It couldn't really be any worse. But that said, 2020 ended up being bad, but not as bad as it might have been when we were facing the worst parts of the lockdown. So yeah, hopefully 2021 for BARC, for Motorsport UK, for everybody, for all the officials, all the volunteers, all the marshals. You know, I'm really hoping that we get a good year, and thanks to everyone for their continued efforts and their continued support in helping us to do what we do, and we look forward to seeing you at an event very soon.
Ben Taylor there from BARC, and also a special guest appearance from my dog Buddy in there as well. Thank you very much for that, Buddy. I'm going to pass now back to John, who is going to take us through some more of the future considerations when we come out of this pandemic. John.
Thank you, James. So this is a bit of a summary really where we are with review dates, etc. I think, as we touched on, this is very fluid, and we have to be dynamic, and things change every day. So whatever we set today will likely to change next week, next month, etc. And it was only yesterday that we found out that Guernsey overnight went from having no limitation on gatherings to suddenly having a really strict lockdown, to the point that you can't even go out to get a takeaway. And if you can't work from home, you don't go to work effectively. But that's for 2 weeks, and they hope that actually after the 2 weeks they'll come back to normal. So that sort of touches on. I've probably brought the bottom of the list, bottom of this list here at the top, to say that in Guernsey and Channel Islands, the likes of Guernsey's part of the Bailiwick Islands, and they are at different rates to all the other nations. And in general, all the different nations have managed this in a different way. We are speaking to all the individual groups and try and push as much as we can for motorsport, but of course, trying to make sure that we do run safely as well. So we're waiting till middle of February at the moment to see what happens in England. Personally, and it is a personal point of view, I think we are very likely to have our lockdown extended, but we have to see what happens. And we have to work accordingly. So there's no point us actually putting a date to say that we're going to restart motorsport in March, April, May, because we could either be premature, or we could end up being a bit over restrictive by trying to put a date too further down the line, and actually other things are able to take place. So it's trying to get a balance of it. One thing we have learned from what we've done last year, we can actually make changes very quickly. Where was last March, we didn't have anything in place and we had to develop guidance. Now we can actually alter it as we need to for the different areas, of the country, and something that makes it fit for all and safe again. Same goes for Scotland. We're middle of February. They've extended their lockdown, and it is subject to a regular review. I think they have a review almost every week in Scotland. And Wales, they've got a review on the 29th of January. At the moment, they're a level 4 lockdown where no motorsport can take place. If they go back down to a level 3 with a maximum of 30 participants, our aim is obviously trying to actually unlock it so it can go beyond 30 participants and actually make most motorsport events practical in Wales. But they have been badly affected, as Ben and Neil have spoken about. And same with Northern Ireland, the lockdown's till 5th of March. Nikki spoke very well about where we are with Northern Ireland, and again there's a review later on. So we are keeping our fingers on the pulse, keeping watch what's going on. One thing I will really stress though, first of all, we are looking to how we can use electronic means far better in the future. People have actually seen that as one of the benefits since we've gone into this new sort of COVID guidance. But actually things have been a little bit more efficient in certain areas. And Joe is going to talk about timekeeping shortly, and the same as Nigel on scrutineering. So there are a number of things that we want to alter. We want to get away from a lot of the old paperwork analog forms, but we appreciate there's some circumstances where they must remain in place as well. When you're out in a muddy field in the middle of nowhere, you may not have access to electronic means to actually send something or type something up there and then. But we are looking to go in that sort of direction. It has worked very well. But the other last thing I would really point out is we have a bit of a challenge at times with some of these non-Motorsport UK events. And Ben referred to like these illegal events in Wales, etc. But ignoring government guidance, or some of them assume they're running to government guidance because they're using our guidance that we've put together. It's taken a lot of time, resource, money, etc., to get the guidance together. And it's very important it's run to its entirety. You can't just cherry pick bits and pieces. And I would stress, if any of yourselves, if you're involved with any events that are non-Motorsport UK, please have a close look to see what rules are actually running to, because in many cases I would question whether they are actually valid. We've made a conscious effort working with our insurers, being totally transparent with them what we're doing, and they're satisfied with the levels that we're taking, the risk management levels we're taking. Of course, our insurers are dealing with other sports as well, but it's very important that any of these other events outside Motorsport UK, that you distance yourself if you think they're not complying to government guidance or any of the rules. So please keep a close watch. If there's any concerns or issues you want to bring to our attention anytime, please let us know. As I said, it is very fluid. We hope to have further updates when we get to a point of unlocking, and the point of unlocking will be different with the different nations. So there won't be just one fit for all change. I'm sure there will be changes, but we will keep you up to date. As soon as we know, we'll keep you updated. We do not have any privileged information. We do not know, other than working with the sporting, departments. So the likes of when Boris Johnson makes an announcement, we don't know anything further before you do. When he makes that announcement, then DCMS work very quickly to actually understand what the interpretation is for sports. So a big thank you to you all. There will be, I'm sure, further questions coming up, but I'm going to hand you back over to Dr. Paul Trafford to talk about testing, and you'll touch about Appendix S, etc. So thank you very much.
Thanks, John. We just wanted to explain what we've done in the way of testing and screening and what might happen in the future. I'm going to start at the bottom with temperature checking. People are obsessed with why aren't we checking everyone's temperature? I get asked all the time at the touring cars, why aren't we doing this? We should be checking everyone's temperature. Frankly, it's a waste of time. The equipment that's used to do it isn't great unless you're spending an awful lot of money on it. It involves people being in close proximity to the person you're going to check. So we put a whole new level of risk in place by stopping everyone as they enter the venue. And that involves putting a window down, 2 people coming face to face while they try and check a temperature. If you're using more fancy and sophisticated equipment, it's difficult to do it through a windscreen without, again, getting in close proximity. And not everyone who has COVID will have a temperature. The number, a percentage that will have a high temperature is quite low compared to the overall rate. And frankly, if you've got a high temperature, you won't feel very well. And if you're trying to get into the event not feeling very well, I would question, what we should be doing with you. And if you want to get into the event and you've got a temperature, you will sit with the air conditioning on your face for 10 minutes. Or you'll put cold water on your face and try and cool yourself down, because everyone knows what's there, the temperature's being checked. So a complete waste of time. It does make people feel better. It makes people feel as though something's being done. But in terms of how effective it isn't really effective and causes a lot of angst, delay and problems. In terms of testing for COVID, be it with one of these newer tests called lateral flow, which gives you a result in 15-30 minutes, or the traditional test where you stick the swab up the nose or the back of the throat, send it off to a laboratory and wait 24 hours or 48 hours. That's great for Formula One and for some of the high-end FIA events where all the competitors, all the officials and everyone can be isolated and be told to go into a protected bubble and stay on site for a significant period of time. Most of the Motorsport UK events are 1 day, some are 2 days, and that's about it. And so we don't have everyone in one place for long enough to actually make testing worthwhile. Unless you're going to all isolate all the time between events and have regular testing. One test on its own just means at that point you're not proving a positive test, and sadly the quick tests aren't as reliable as the ones that take longer. So we haven't gone down the route of testing because it doesn't really work for motorsport in the UK, except for the big event like Formula One, and they have their own rules for that, but they also insist people travel in groups, that they stay in the same hotels, and that just wouldn't work for grassroots motorsport. Most people are going home, working, mixing with other people, so the testing route doesn't work. In terms of the vaccination, we all know that the vaccination, you've only got to watch the news and the TV. The vaccination doesn't stop you, as far as people know, as yet, in spreading the virus. So you can be vaccinated, it will stop you being unwell, but you can still catch the virus or carry it and spread it. The vaccination doesn't work in 100% of people who get it. So there'll still be some people who are vaccinated who aren't immune from COVID. So, whether or not somebody decides we're going to use the vaccination status to allow you into events, I have no idea. Certainly, I don't think Motorsport UK will introduce it in isolation. Whether the government introduce it is another issue, but then there's going to have to be some sort of vaccination passport that you're aware that you actually have been vaccinated and carry it. I saw that some of the cruise liners are going to insist that people have been vaccinated, but again, not everyone is given anything when they're vaccinated. I've had my vaccination at work and we weren't given anything. Some people have been given a little card after the first vaccination. Few people have had the second one, so we don't really know what will happen. So that's something that I think we'll have to wait and see. I think most effectively is making people aware of what the symptoms are, making people aware that they have a responsibility to be careful, and if you feel ill, not to come to an event. We have pre-event signing on, which you have to declare you're well, and self-isolation if you do develop COVID. And I think irrespective of what strain we're talking about, there was a question about the newer strains. Yes, they are more transmissible. Yes, they think they may lead to a higher mortality, but you know, you need big numbers to actually be accurate with these things. But it really doesn't matter from the point of view of what you can do about it. You can wash your hands, you can wear a mask, you can keep some social distance, wear protection, wear whatever you can, be sensible, and it's irrelevant what virus you're talking about. They're the only procedures we have in place until a vaccine comes along and everyone's vaccinated and it dies down. So that's about it. So I think when motorsport starts, there's not going to be a lot of difference in the way we do it. It will unroll gently. It's not suddenly going to be back to normal like in 2019. We will start to unroll these things slowly, and you will still be filling in questionnaires to make sure you're symptom free, applying some common sense, and washing your hands at events and wearing masks for a little while to come. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Paul. I'm going to pass over now to Joe Hickerton, who's going to talk us through some timekeeping.
Thank you, James. Yeah, I'm just going to give you a brief overview of some of the changes in procedures that have made it possible to continue timekeeping duties during COVID-19. So firstly, as a basic principle across the whole sport, wherever possible, remote timing services and procedures should be used. And as an example, just to take this further for race events, that means only transponder timing is to be used. The number of people on the timekeeping team needs to be limited. And in many cases, this might mean reducing the normal number of personnel, just to ensure that appropriate social distancing can be maintained at all times. There needs to be a reliance on electronic forms of communication, so replacing paper-based processes, printed results sheets, things like that. For results, these should be issued digitally and circulated using text messages, emails, or messenger services. And the same use of these services or even video calls or video messages can and should even be used for any queries that people want to submit to find out further information. For sprints and hill climbs specifically, the organisers have been given the ability to select their preferred method, their preferred start line method, so as to maintain a socially distanced environment in a way that suits their individual situation the best. Moving on to the next slide, please. For rally and cross country, time cards and check sheets aren't to be passed backwards and forwards between competitors and officials for obvious reasons of avoiding that contact point. Results are therefore calculated from timekeeper and marshal check sheets only, and again, these are to be communicated virtually by messaging services and so on, as we went through before. So as you can see throughout all of this, the emphasis really is partly common sense, and it's all very much on ensuring contactless, paperless procedures, and of course preserving that socially distanced environment, all for very obvious reasons. John mentioned earlier that there's specific guidance documents on the COVID-19 area of the websites, and in the documents for each discipline they will outline the specific guidance for timing aspects within that discipline. So do make sure that you're checking there regularly to ensure you've got the most up-to-date information as we move forward. If things do change, that's where any updates will be hosted. So as far as timekeeping goes, that's really all we have to say today. I think I'm handing over to Sue next for the scrutineering slide.
You are indeed, yes. Thank you very much, Joe. There are a number of scrutineering questions. Some have come up before, and some have come up on the website, and I'm going to ask Nigel Jones to help me with this. Nigel is one of our technical commissioners and also is part of the technical working group for training, as well as being part of our technical group for developing regulations and making sure all our scrutineers are doing the right job at the right time. So thank you for joining us, Nigel. The first question I want to ask is about self-declaration, and I know a number of questions have come up about that, both now and previously. So, is it here to stay, and how is that going to affect scrutineering in a morning? Are we not going to have those queues anymore? What's it going to look like?
Hi Sue, afternoon everyone. Yes, to answer your first question, competitor self-declaration is here to stay. It will evolve over the coming months to be a more user-friendly and efficient process. We are currently working on that, and we will be covering in greater detail what the plans are in the scrutineering sessions that we've got next week. For post-event, pre-event scrutineering, we will, currently it's a visual inspection of 10 to 20% of the cars, and the plan is that when we go post-COVID, we will still do 10 to 20%, but that will be more hands-on, giving the scrutineers more time to do more in-depth inspection of the vehicles. So yes, it will continue, but the numbers will be smaller, and yes, the queues will be smaller. So it should run more efficiently.
Okay, thank you. And also just to confirm that environmental checks will continue as normal. So that doesn't change, does it?
No, we during 2020, once the season got underway, right the way through to the end, we did not get any issues over the environmental scrutineering side of things. Everyone seemed happy, so there's no reason to change that, and it will pre and post COVID continue. Okay, there is another question that's been raised about self-declaration. So before I move on to the second pre-seminar question, how about the fact that we are only checking a certain sample on a regular basis? How are we going to keep a check of who has been scrutineered in depth and who hasn't? Is there a database, or how is that going to be managed, please? Currently, the chief scrutineer will keep a record of every car that has been checked as a normal process to cross-reference that against a signing on sheet provided by the organisers. So there is no reason why the chief scrutineer cannot keep a list of all of the cars that have gone through the 10 to 20% sample inspection, and this becomes part of the event paperwork. This goes through to the event secretariat, who can pass it on to the next round chief scrutineer, or indeed the chief scrutineer can pass it on to the next chief scrutineer if he's not going to chief the next round. And because the 10 to 20% is random, they can make sure that they don't expect the same car at every event. And I think it was alluded to that some people won't be checked at all. That shouldn't be the case. The record should be passed on so that every car will be checked at least once, if not twice, during the season.
Okay, thank you. So we can now move on to the second of our pre-seminar questions, and this is about non-conformance. how do we deal with that if a car does not conform with their self-declaration?
Okay, so if the scrutineer inspects a car and finds that what the competitor has declared, the car is not in accordance with that, then that goes to the chief scrutineer. The chief scrutineer will then report it to the clerk of the course, and the clerk of the course has action to take with the evidence provided by the chief scrutineer. The appropriate action, as we see it, is in accordance with C2.1.1F, which is exclusion.
Sorry, I have gone on to mute unintentionally. So well remembered that number, or maybe you sneakily had it written down, I'm not sure. The third question, and I will come to John Ryan in a moment for one of the other questions that we've actually got to answer live. So third question, Nigel, for you. What about the size of the scrutineering teams? Does this mean that, you know, they're going to be much smaller? What about succession planning? What about trainees? How does all that work, please?
We don't see the scrutineering teams actually getting smaller. There are, apart from the initial safety scrutineering session, first thing, there are scrutineers have roles and responsibilities, and we don't see them changing. They do have to cover the practice sessions. They do have to cover assembly area, parc fermé duties, stage starts, incidents. There's normally a scrutineer available at all times to cover any incidents and any reports that need to be done on damaged vehicles that are delivered to parc fermé. So no, we don't see the team size changing. What we do see is that first thing in the morning, the scrutineers will have more time on a car to do the inspection. We don't expect it to be reduced to one or two that are running around like headless chickens trying to achieve that smaller number. It means that that same number can give the cars more attention.
Lovely, thank you. And then last question for you before I go over to a couple of questions for John Ryan. Is it going to be mandatory now for all passports, for vehicle passports, to become digital? Is that where we're going with this now? And if so, how does that actually come together?
Yeah, we do see that in the future all competing cars will have a vehicle passport. It will not happen overnight. There is a large amount of cars. We see that this will eventually roll out over the next 2 or 3 years. Yes, they will become digital, and the fullness of time, there should be a database that on the day the chief scrutineer can access to get data on any one particular car referencing the passport number. It is something that will happen, but it will take an awful lot of work to achieve this, and it won't, as I say, it won't happen overnight, but in the fullness of time we can see it coming together.
Lovely, that's really helpful. Thank you very much. I'm aware that there are a number of questions about scrutineering in the Q&A box, and I feel that some of those will be very definitely handled either on Tuesday at the cart scrutineering session or on Friday at the car scrutineering session. So if we're not answering them all right now, it'll be because they're actually going to be answered in the scrutineering specific module later on in the week. However, in the meantime, John, may I ask you, please, one of them is, with the limited number of events, have there been any incidents where using self-declaration has actually compromised safety in any way? Would you please just update us on that?
Yes, of course, Sue. We have not got any reports where that has compromised safety. First and foremost, there's a number of questions actually all related to the self-declaration scrutineering, the numbers of people, etc. One thing is for sure, the technical departments always receive a large number of calls and queries, but it's increased even more now actually from the competitors and preparers. So this is actually quite a good thing, rather than just relying on to make sure that the car is correct and fit for purpose. We have to be bearing in mind the scrutineer in all cases is doing some basic checks, but they're not expected to check every nut and bolt of a car. So all the way through, although they'll check some of the basic safety equipment, the very basics for a competitor, checking that the bolts are on tight for their wheels and suspension components and all that, that is down to the preparation and the onus is upon them as a preparer or competitor to ensure it's correct, and that's in the yearbook. So first of all, I just want to reassure the scrutineers, and we will cover this more during the scrutineering sessions next week. So I won't go into too much detail there. But we certainly haven't seen a negative effect. And in fact, like I say, it's a bit more positive, the fact that they're asking us questions. What we do need to do is develop even more. You'll see that we have got a number of different sort of guidance documents of seats and harnesses and everything else. We need to increase that and actually make sure we're a bit more interactive with small videos and that to help with that further training and development. And what I would stress to a lot of scrutiny is that I know there's a concern about what is it about a newcomer, if the bolts on a cage aren't tightened properly. If you do see a new competitor, and the club should encourage any new competitors to contact the scrutineers before the event itself and ask some of these questions. And if they're unsure, there is the ability to still scrutineer some of the cars, but it's just a smaller percentage, etc. So I think just trying to be a little bit, dynamic with your approach. And we do hear some of the concerns, but we have seen some positive use of the reduced scrutiny, or sort of reduced scrutineering, but actually reducing the number of cars that you do pre-event, but doing more comprehensive checks later on, because of the 6 minutes that are allocated to do scrutineering in general, in the main. I know some clubs and championships will offer more, but quite often the 6 minutes is not enough really to do a full comprehensive check. And I think one of the vital things for the higher risk areas of motorsports, when we're looking at the circuit racing and rally, etc., is that the use of the vehicle passport will be very important. And that's something that we want to develop now for the race car world. And we're looking to go digital. So that information can be shared very quickly and easy between scrutineers and Motorsport UK. So I think that's a step forward. And we will go into further detail for the scrutineering questions during the sessions that we have next week as well.
Lovely, thank you, John. I think the only other one that perhaps is relevant, because we've also got clerks and stewards as well as trainees and many others involved, and that is, some scrutineers are reporting that they're being asked to work on their own and those sorts of things because of the new guidance and G716. I wonder if you could just say anything about that regulation and how it's being implemented.
Well, we have not actually said scrutineers have to work on their own. It's just making sure that social distancing measures are in place and reducing the team. What you can't have is obviously a big team congregating without the right PPE measures, etc. So we're not saying you're restricted to one scrutineer. That's down to the club and championship to make decisions. And what I would suggest to the chief scrutineer is to make sure they delegate duties beforehand and try and make good use of the online scrutineering, using video calls, etc. I know that's not always possible when you're out in the muddy field, but in general, prior to the event, what's very important is the declarations that were being put forward from the competitors to actually have a good review of those. And that's an area sometimes the quality hasn't been perfect, not from the scrutineer side, but from the competitor side. If you're not happy that the information they provided is not correct, then go back to them. Go back to them before the event started where you can. And if they've taken the risk as a competitor to come up to the event with something that's not compliant, then they obviously potentially forfeit their event. Of course, the competitors are our customers, so we're not trying to restrict them from competing. We just want to make sure they're running safe and fairly. So just please bear that in mind.
Lovely, thank you. Well, quite a lot of really, really good questions. I hope that's helped. And I know all of the other ones that we've got in that box we'll be taking attention of, and John and his team will transfer those over either to Tuesday night car session or Friday night car session. Just make sure you sign up for whichever one of those to get those detailed responses. So from scrutineering, we now move over to Dan Carter, our safety executive, to introduce us to the updates and refresher of where we are with incident reporting.
Okay, thank you, Sue. So yeah, the presentation on incident reporting will be fairly short. It's going to be more of a refresher from the seminars presented last year, and really to provide you some updates on what to expect for 2021. This is your opportunity to ask any questions, and Sue is on hand to keep an eye out on any questions coming in, so please do send us your questions. The first message that we would like to emphasize really is one of teamwork and roles and responsibilities. As you can see on the page, we got 3 roles: the steward, the clerk of the course, and scrutineer. But it's quite clear that to run an event, you need many more individuals, both licensed and unlicensed. And whenever there is an incident, obviously teamwork is going to be vital to ensure that all of the tasks that are required can be completed successfully. So if we move to the steward at the top here, obviously the steward is our eyes and ears. They're there to observe. And if there is an incident, obviously, then they need to contact Motorsport UK. The number provided there is a dedicated emergency phone number, which is to the safety team. And that will be answered by a member of the safety team, likely to be John Ryan, unless he's on holiday or got fed up of answering the calls on the weekend, and it might be passed to myself or somebody else. But this is really a dedicated number for emergencies, so we would ask that you do not phone the switchboard. Even if your event is during the week, it's better to phone this number, as you'll be directed to somebody that can actually assist you quicker and have the information to hand to assist you. That phone number is on 24/7, so 7 days a week. It won't get switched off. So the steward is there obviously to work with the clerk of the course to ensure the paperwork and documentation is completed. And again, there are other officials around to help and assist in doing so. And then when all that paperwork is collated, information is together, they need to send that to Motorsport UK, and we'll come to in a little bit later on how that information will come back to us. The clerk of the course is obviously ultimately responsible and accountable for the event. They're running the event, and when an incident occurs, they have to safely deploy any medical resources to that incident and inform the steward of the meeting that there is a red flag or an incident. And I would like to actually expand that a little bit more and say that they should be informing all senior officials so that everybody at the event understands what is happening and what their roles and responsibilities are. To ensure that a time log is completed, so not all events will have a time log that's running during the day. So if you're at an event that doesn't have a time log, ensure that somebody is responsible for noting when an incident occurs, when resources are getting sent to that location, when they arrive, etc. And that is handed back to the steward at the end. And also to ensure the officials' well-being. So even after the event, when everybody's gone home, there'll be a lot of people that were involved in that incident. And the clerk, obviously leading their team, should really inform or contact everybody involved, make sure they're okay. If there is any post-incident support required, then inform Motorsport UK so we can set that up. And then lastly there, we've got the chief scrutineer. Obviously his roles and responsibilities are to preserve any vehicle involved in an incident in park-friendly conditions, so that means no team member coming to tamper with the vehicle, ensure a safe and secure location for any vehicles. Now, if it's the police have got involved, they may actually take the vehicle with them, but if it's an incident where the police haven't turned up and Motorsport UK would still like that vehicle to be retained somewhere, then it's the chief scrutineer's responsibility to try and find a safe and secure location to store that vehicle. And obviously conduct any preliminary inspection of vehicles that might be involved in incidents, taking lots of photos to assist Motorsport UK in any investigation. We would ask obviously that that doesn't involve any dismantling or taking apart in any way the vehicle at that moment in time. All of this information can be found obviously online in our e-module. So for those that haven't already logged on and done the serious incident reporting e-module, please do so. We would highly recommend that you actually do that. So moving on to the serious incident pack, I think you all should be aware that we have a serious incident pack which is actually uploaded on our website. For 2021, we will be doing an update for that pack. And several changes that we're looking at are, one is a rebranding, which is a slight logo change or color change for the logo. The incident pack itself has gone through a full legal review. Our underwriters, our insurance brokers and external legal consultants have gone through the pack and made any changes necessary to ensure that we're getting all the information that we need. We're going to be looking at updating the incident definitions. So from previous years, we've had comments that it's a little bit difficult to establish when reporting should take place. So we're going to make it clearer what incidences should be reported and what information that we need back at Motorsport UK. And then lastly, there's a new media team contact, as now we have a new Director of Marketing and Communications, Tracy Novak, and her email, phone number, mobile number will be in the media section for those that have media queries. So the question there posed is why do we need to submit reports? So several reasons, obviously to protect all individuals involved in or touched by an incident, and also perhaps more importantly, to update any regulations or processes to ensure where possible we prevent that accident or incident from happening again. And really emphasize this, that it's not about blaming people or individuals. This is really about learning and where we can to improve our regulations and processes. So the incident has occurred at your event. You've collected all the information. Now you need to submit that back to Motorsport UK. As we mentioned earlier, on the back of the permit and available to all stewards will be that emergency phone number. So please do contact us straight away and we can guide you through what you need to do, how to best deal with any authorities that turn up. That documentation is to be submitted back to Motorsport UK as soon as practically possible and no later than noon on Monday. And for this is really important for us, certainly at Motorsport UK, as when we get back to the office, we'll be trying to establish links with the authorities, the police, the local authorities, and for us to understand what has actually happened, to read through the documentation before we make them phone calls is vital. And sending documentation, how to send that documentation. Now we've moved into the COVID and also post-COVID era, we're now moving towards more digital means. So we would ask that if you can send that via digital methods, and James a little later will actually explain how to do that. But where original paperwork still exists, then retain that and also submit that to Motorsport UK so we don't lose any paperwork.
Dan, can I just ask you before we move on, the phone number that people ring, just in case, who do they speak to? Where does it go to? What happens when you get that phone call?
Yeah, as I mentioned earlier, this is a dedicated safety emergency phone number, so it does come to us in the safety department. It's answered most of the time by John Ryan, but it's not linked to his personal number at all, so it can move around through either John, myself, or somebody else in the organisation.
Okay, so it's always going to be someone who knows what they're doing anyway. So the people will be supported, whoever they speak to.
Yes. Yeah.
Lovely, thank you. So we have had a few questions and answers that people have raised in advance. So I think probably we've got a number here, Dan, and rather than going through them individually, I think the bottom line is that all of those can be found in the incident pack in the resource centre. I know you've mentioned already that that's going to get updated. You'll see that what we've got there is version 5, but I know when it gets updated, you'll show the new version number and, of course, its date. The only one question, which I'm not sure, Dan, whether it's for you or for James, is if we haven't got access quite easily, can we take or can photographs of the documentation that we've filled out by hand be emailed, and are they acceptable?
Yeah, so firstly, we mentioned here about collecting documentation. If it was taken away by the police, we do ask that you take photocopies of all paperwork and ensure that you keep copies of all paperwork, and then do get that to us. Obviously, once the steward has phoned us and made first contact, we can work with them on how to send that to us. And if there's any sensitive documentation, either medical or graphic photos, videos, etc., they can be sent to us in the safety team directly.
Okay, lovely. Thank you very much. Thank you.
Yeah, thank you very much, Sue. Thank you, Dan. As Dan was mentioning there about electronic documents, all of the incident report forms, incident pack, etc., as he says, can be downloaded from the Motorsport UK Resource Centre. If you go onto the Motorsport UK website, have a look at the toolbar at the top of the screen, it will be on the right-hand side, Resource Centre. Once you're on that page, you can use the filters on the left-hand side to find the forms relevant to your role, and there's plenty of different forms on there under different topics. If you click on the filter that says officials, you can then filter it by the different type of role that you carry out. Please do remember to save the document to your computer and then open it in a PDF viewer before trying to save that document. If you open it in your browser, the information that you type in won't be saved. So just make sure that you do that to save yourself having to retype it for a second time. Something that's very important, of course, is that you as senior officials and with your organising team actually discuss how documents are going to be shared between yourselves before the event actually takes place. What we're saying is that we don't want people turning up on the day and thinking, well, I haven't got a laptop, so what's going to happen now? We need to preempt this a little bit and figure out a plan of action before we turn up at the event itself. It might be that you consider using things such as WeTransfer or Dropbox to share documentation. Bearing in mind, we're not just talking about incident reports here, we're talking about any type of documentation during the course of an event. It might be your judicial paperwork. Are you going to use email? Are you going to send it via WhatsApp, etc., etc.? There's plenty of ways that we can do it. We just need to make sure that everybody on the organising team is aware of how that's going to happen. If you need any advice or any guidance, always just pick up the phone or drop us an email and we'll be happy to support you in that. Now, since July, the Motorsport UK stewards have been asked to send their reports electronically where possible, and then Rachel Gascoigne, the stewards administrator, has sent out some guidance on that, informing stewards on how to use a different filing system and create folders to be able to send the different documents into Motorsport UK. That guidance document and also a how-to video can be found on the Motorsport UK website in the Resource Centre, and we would encourage all officials just to take a quick look at that so that they can understand how stewards are being asked to send their paperwork in. Sensitive incident data, as it says there, it can be sent directly to the Safety Executive, to Dan Carter, or to the Safety Director, John Ryan, things such as photos or videos of incidents which you might not want to include inside your steward's report form itself. So we're going to move to the last session of the webinar this morning, or afternoon as it is now, which is the Q&A session. So I'm going to go through a few questions that we've received in advance of the session today, and I will pass them out to some of my colleagues on the panel. So the first question here, which I'm going to ask Dan to come in on, please. What is the latest Motorsport UK advice on the use of drones for filming of Motorsport UK permitted events? And what attitude should the steward take, and what power does the steward have to stop their use? Dan.
Okay, thank you, James. So Motorsport UK does have a policy for applying to fly a drone at a Motorsport UK event, and this is handled by our communications team. This only applies to media and commercial purposes, so there's no recreational activities allowed. The policy involves the applicant submitting certain documentation such as insurance policies, flight plans, CAA approval, landowners approval, etc. So basically, if somebody does apply, then we will notify the steward that there is a drone possibly flying at one of their events. What happens if they don't get notified by Motorsport UK that there's a drone and they happen to see a drone? Well, the steward does have the power, obviously, to suspend or stop an event if there is a safety or a risk to safety. We would ask that they communicate and work with closely the clerk of the course, and also perhaps the venue management, venue owner, to see if if there is a safety risk, try and deal with that risk, and then if obviously the risk passes, whether they can resume the motorsport event again.
Thanks, Dan. Yeah, absolutely. And emphasis again on working together, please. Question number 2 then, I'm going to come to John Ryan, please. Are Motorsport UK planning on issuing a yearbook errata to cover the approved regulation changes that didn't make it into the 2021 yearbook?
Thank you, James. Yes, as of previous years, we always have quite an early closing date for the yearbook. So usually October the year before is at the point where we have to publish the yearbook. However, we do update it now. It's live on the website, the yearbook, and there's the erratas also published on the website. So any changes that are made towards the end of the year, and actually during the course of the year, it's very important that things do change at times, especially if it's a clarification, a correction, or a matter of urgent safety. Things can change mid-season, especially during this sort of COVID period. We've had to make quite a few changes with short notice. I also would ask, in particular, the clerk stewards and scrutineers to please take a sight of newsletters every month, because we'll update you of any important information that's relevant through those letters, and always see it as a bit of an extension to the yearbook.
Thank you very much, John. And as John says, keep an eye out for those bulletins. And if you're not receiving them, do get in touch with us, and we will make sure we've got the correct contact details for you on our system. Question 3 on your screen then. How should judicial decisions be communicated in a paperless manner, and do they still need to be signed by the clerk or steward and the competitor? I'm going to bring in Joel Cohen, if I may, our General Secretary from Motorsport UK. Joel.
Thanks, James. In answering that, the organisers must establish the infrastructure to be used in conjunction with the venue and the officials in order to deliver that function. The method chosen must be notified to all participants in advance with the final instructions or other official notice, and if it changes, then further notice should be given. It is acceptable to use email, Wi-Fi, WhatsApp or SMS with the relevant documents attached. Do remember that a typed signature is entirely valid, and that allowance must be made between the time of a decision and the time at which it is communicated for the purpose of the appeal.
Thank you, Joel. And if I can also throw question number 4 to you regarding scrutineers receiving copies of competitors' self-declaration forms that still have the competitors' personal details on them. Are they contravening the Data Protection Act by receiving the information, and how are they protected?
So in answering that, James, the scrutineers and other officials derive their authority from their licence appointment by ourselves at Motorsport UK. And competitors similarly provide the data for the purpose of being licensed. So the scrutineer is receiving the data in that context, and provided that it is not further distributed or processed erratically, there is no breach. So the protection for that arises in the context of the performance of an essential safety function to a body, ourselves, as authorised by statute.
Thank you very much, Joel. And Sue, I'm going to pass over to you now, please.
Well, blended. Thank you, James. I also have another question to add into here as well, which is still in the Q&A box. Can I start first of all? May I ask, James, how has the pandemic and Brexit affected marshalling abroad authorisations? So could you please just cover off question 5 for me?
Sure. Well, obviously, the pandemic and Brexit bring about their own circumstances, and notwithstanding the travel restrictions and things that are placed on all of us at the moment, which actually effectively makes marshalling abroad rather a moot point at the moment anyway. The process for obtaining a marshalling abroad authorisation remains the same with Motorsport UK. So you can do an application form via the website to apply for marshalling abroad authorisation. The only difference for 2021 is that, of course, your 2020 marshal's registration has been extended for 12 months, so you won't actually receive the 2021 registration card, but we will confirm that your 2020 registration is still valid to the end of 2021. And that, of course, goes the same for the officials' licences, which have also been extended to the end of 2021.
Brilliant. Thank you. So I'm now going to come to John. Question 6, first of all. I mean, obviously, there's a lot of talk about sharing documentation electronically and all those sorts of things, which clearly means we need either some decent signal or we need Wi-Fi to enable us to do that. And also, you know, including for events like cross country, there are clearly difficulties around some of the events, but for specific venues, should this be part of what we look at?
This is something to consider for the future, but part of venue licensing is really looking at the safety of the actual competition route stroke circuits itself, and does not actually look at the facilities and infrastructure of the circuits or venue or routes. But it is something we need to consider in the future. And I've been in talks with a couple of companies this last week or so about how we could expand the use of not just Wi-Fi, but actually 4G, 5G in sort of more remote areas. And there's consideration of using a drone as like a receiver that would actually transmit, you know, a 4G, 5G signal to, you know, to all the competitors, membership, etc. at the event. So these are things we're looking into going forward, but there's certainly no specific requirements at the moment. But I have to say, from, you know, personal experience, when you go to a lot of these circuits and that now, they tend to have actually fairly reasonable coverage with cellular coverage. I think the biggest difficulty is sometimes when you're going out in the sticks at times with some of these rally events, etc. You might struggle for both. You certainly won't have Wi-Fi, and cellular coverage is sometimes very difficult.
Lovely, thank you. So it's nice to know that we are making progress and we're looking at things. So thanks for that, John. While you were there, question 7 also related to rally particularly. A number of people have asked the question, can they actually undertake reconnaissance drives so that they can actually check liaison sections, check closed road sections, check the route in advance of the release of COVID, so that they're kind of ready in the starting blocks as soon as the government guidance enables us to start?
Thank you, Sue. Our advice is that where non-essential travel is not permitted, they should not be doing this. They should not be going, although we trust that the clerks will be very responsible drivers and not put themselves or any other lives at risk trying to drive the route. It's just the fact that it's non-essential travel. It's not an essential thing, you know, for society to continue. So we have to be good, and we need to make sure that we stay clear of that. So what I would suggest is they use other electronic means of doing the setting up the routes and having a look at the routes. And if you need some support and guidance, contact the Motorsport UK competitions department, and they will assist. Okay, lovely. That's really helpful. Thank you, John. So James, back to you. A couple of questions from here, and then one that's been in our Q&A box for about 3/4 of an hour, ready to go for now. The first one is, when can trainee officials restart, especially if they've got all of their, you know, their theory modules completed, they've done all their pre-work, they're just ready for events. When can trainee officials resume training, please?
Yeah, it's a good question, and it's something that we're quite aware of. As you say, Sue, we've got there are a number of officials that are probably ready and waiting to have their assessment done. There are other officials who are just starting out on their training journey and want to be able to get out and do some of the hands-on practical learning that they need to do. We are, of course, monitoring the guidance, as we've been saying throughout the presentation today, and once it's safe and we are able to allow people to shadow other officials and have more people in attendance, then of course we'll make that call and we'll make people aware of that. There may obviously be other creative ways that people can still get that on-event experience without actually being there. Maybe remotely, perhaps they might be able to shadow an official via video calls and things like that. There's other ways that I think we need to have a look at. But certainly, and I see that the question from Mike in the Q&A about e-learning being carried out in small groups. Quite right. Just whilst there's no motorsport going on, it doesn't mean the training has to stop completely. We can still look at other ways, and we can use the Learning Hub, the different modules that are available in there, and you know, we can start to look at, and I think it's a good idea that Mike's come up with, that we could get a group together via Zoom or something like this with the trainees, and we can go through some of those modules together. So there are things we are looking at, and we are going to look at ways that we can get trainees involved as we move forward, and hopefully we can get out on events soon as well.
Lovely, thank you. And the very last question for you, which is about, you know, if we do need to travel overseas, if we're working on international events in any way, what's the insurance situation, please?
Shall I pick that one up, Sue?
Yes, if you wouldn't mind. Great,
you just move to the next slide and we can. There we go. So to note, there are a couple of policies. One is obviously the £100 million cover we've got for public liability that's in place, and obviously the personal accident cover, which is a membership benefit to all competitors, officials and marshals. Also to note, whilst in the UK, the personal accident cover includes your travel to and from home as well, just in case you're involved in an incident traveling to an event or going home at the end of the day. So insurance when you're working overseas, for those that you do travel overseas, the personal accident policy has been extended to Europe, the US and Canada, and that also includes medical expenses and repatriation where necessary. For liability, we have the third party and professional indemnity, which is also extended to Europe. To note, obviously, if there is any officials here today that want to travel abroad to one of them events, they have to notify us 30 days prior using the online form, or a form which is online on our website in the resource centre. The event has to be sanctioned by either the FIA, being an FIA Championship, FIA Series, or an FIA recognised ASN. And certain countries are perhaps exempt or not covered, so I'd highly advise that you look on our website just to check to make sure that the country visiting is within the policy.
Brilliant, thank you very much, Dan. Sue, is there anything else in the Q&A that you wanted to bring up at all, or have we covered off all the open questions now?
I am happy to say that the Q&A box is empty. We have covered everything and also made a comment for those where they'll be picked up on Tuesday or Friday, or in any of the other seminars, of course.
Brilliant, good stuff. Thank you very much, Sue. Thank you to all of our panelists actually for monitoring the Q&A for us this morning. There's been a hell of a lot of questions coming in, and we're thankful for that. You will, of course, all be sent a copy of the combined Q&A from all 4 sessions following following the weekend. So you get all the answers that have been given there. So what's to come this week then? So we've been mentioning about the role-specific webinars taking place in the evening, weekday evenings this week for different roles, from timekeepers taking place tomorrow evening through to car scrutineers on Friday. Clerks, stewards and scrutineers, you'll find the registration details in your latest bulletin. Everyone else, and in fact the clerks, stewards and scrutineers as well, you would have received an email on Thursday of last week, which will give you all of the information that you need to register for those sessions. If you haven't got the details, please just drop us an email at training@motorsportuk.org and we'll send those out to you. But it's very important that you do attend these evening webinars if you can, because they will focus specifically on your role. So what's to come in 2021 for learning and development? As Hugh touched upon earlier, we had a lot of plans across the organisation for 2020, which for the same with a lot of people, plans had to be put on hold. But 2021, we're hoping to push ahead with a few of these projects. Officials, webinars and meetings, things like this that we're doing today, this is not going to go away. This is going to be something that we want to keep doing. It's a great way for us to be able to reach out to you and to speak to a great number of you at the same time. So we're planning on doing regular webinars throughout the course of the year for different types of officials, and we hope that you'll join us for them. We'll also be doing a dedicated CART judicial webinar in February as well. And a reminder as well that the Clerks and Stewards webinar on Wednesday evening is focused on judicial procedures. Online learning modules, we've spoken about the Learning Hub, and we will continue, as Hugh says, to create more modules and to create more learning opportunities using that platform. We're also going to look at creating some tailored modules to club officials as well. We need to start to provide some guidance and some training to the vital roles such as Secretary of the Meeting, Chief Marshal, Club Stewards, etc. So we'll be doing that during the course of this year as well. Taster Days, we are looking to continue our focus on the recruitment, retention and recognition of our volunteer officials and marshals, and we're planning to run a programme of Taster Days during the back end of this year, so we can start to bring in the next generation of our volunteers, of our officials, and this will include some introductory modules which again will be available through the Learning Hub, so people can understand what being an official is actually made up of and what it entails. The Marshal Pathway, we are looking to streamline the Marshal's grading scheme to make it clearer and transparenter and to make it easier to follow as people develop through their marshalling journey. This will be done, of course, in consultation with the marshalling community, and it will mean, of course, that we will update all of our learning and development materials for our Motorsport UK trainers before the end of 2021 going into 2022. So as you can see, there's a lot for us to do there, and we can't do it without your support. So please do keep giving us your feedback on all of these topics today. The next steps then, if you haven't already, please do log into the Learning Hub. You can do that by logging into the Motorsport UK website and then clicking on the Learning Hub logo. Once you're in the Learning Hub, click on Volunteers and then Officials to find the relevant modules for this series. From the 1st of February, we'll be adding a self-assessment and feedback survey link on there. But at the moment, there is 2 sections that you can fill in. The first one is on effective communication, and the second one is a serious incident reporting awareness module. So go on, complete those, and then go on and complete the survey on the 1st of February, and that will give you a certificate to prove that you've completed your grade maintenance for 2021. That's all I've got to say for this afternoon, but I want to thank everyone for joining us today and to our panelists as well for taking some time out of their weekend to join us and to answer all of the questions. I will pass over now to Hugh Chambers to close us out.
Thank you, James. A big thank you to everybody for attending the call today, giving up your Sunday mornings. I very much hope that you found it useful and informative. We've had a total of 71 questions answered this morning, and hopefully an awful lot of others answered live that had come up beforehand. So I hope you feel better equipped for dealing with the 2021 season. We have the specialist seminars running through the evenings this week, which will no doubt pick up further points that you may have. Please do contact us directly. You have our numbers and you have our emails. Let us know if you've got any worries or concerns, questions that are outstanding. We're here to help. We're here to make sure that we can get back to competing absolutely as soon as possible.